We have already seen that duality is inherent in everything in the universe. To understand our relationship with time, however, it might be best to consider one pair of opposites in particular: the cell structure of the bacteria, usually a formless protozoa with a coat of sensitive fibers, and that of the virus, a finely honed hexagonal-headed killer designed to seek and destroy other living cells, with a distinct lower body equipped with gripping limbs capable of anchoring it to its prey. Here we see that humanity truly is a hybrid species of bacteria, the body of flesh, muscle, organs, and virus, the brainstem, the eyes, the limbs and digits, the lungs, the pathways through the system. It is for this reason that we are tailor-made to confront the concept of time, because its effect upon the universe is like that of a disease in a human, and the universe has yet evolved in symbiosis with it, just as has the human body unified the bacterial and viral forms. From birth until death, we are time travelers visiting this dimension. In this field of phased matter, time passes through everything. It seems to be coming from nowhere and causing the universe to expand. It is really coming from outside of the universe and merely causing the universe to attract. Time is made up of microwave gravitons known as torus-shaped tachyons, light faster than light. These cause gravity as a repulsive force, faster than light, to flow opposite entropy, which, on the level of subspace below photic velocity, causes it to act as an attractive force. The greatest centers of gravity, or the oldest probabilities to begin to spin in the universe, now black holes at the centers of galaxies, emit these from a higher dimension into our own. This higher dimension is the space of the fourth temporal dimension. Our souls are born through these sun-eaters, the same as our bodies are born from our mother's womb. The first portrayal of the concept of time was as a storm over the grass fields and a flood of the rivers and lakes, followed, according to Scripture, by a rainbow to symbolize that such a storm would never happen again. This was during the time of the first hominids, and subsequently associated with the era of the mother goddess. It may have been time itself that caused her change of face from Isis, the twin stars of Sirius, to the moon and Venus, the morning star. Time changes everything. It is the sum effect of all forces. It is a shape in hyperdimension that creates the planar waves of emotion as it moves through our aura of perception into our mind. We are a living, organic, fractal refraction of it as it is reflected off the surface of itself. However, all of this is only time moving through us. The goal of human life and of the great work of the occult is to reverse the flow of entropy. The evidence for this is how the common man, through the millennia, has been gradually manipulated by the various orders into working for his welfare, fighting upstream of entropy. Meanwhile, politics only exists as the argument over what to do with those people unwilling or unable to do likewise, who float with the flow of entropy. Meanwhile, entropy itself is misrepresented as chaos, when really it is simply temporally inverted order of a higher dimension. When people first began writing in ancient Egypt at the time of Nephthys, they described the material universe as comprised of vessels housing energy. Now we know that what they were describing was the holographic torus shape of the tachyon and the microwave vibrational frequencies that caused them to assume this form. However, the ancient comparison of the Ka to ships for the greater ethereal energy of the lesser electromagnetic soul should be taken for noting when considering the human relation to time in the light of travel. The system passed down to us from the ancients describes a spirit which is eternal formlessness outside the temporal universe, a soul which is immortal energy inside the temporal universe, and a body or self which is mortal matter inside the temporal universe. In truth, the only fact the people of this planet have ever known is the mortality of the corporeal form, while they pray for their souls, still playing make-believe like little children hoping the impossible come true, and revel in the communal spirit, calling it the Holy Ghost, making any young fool scapegoat for the millennial in-joke of the occult. Scientists of today are more interested in what parts of the brain control what functions of action and reaction than ever, and this is in large part due to a heavy reliance on the part of neurologists on the encroaching application of wave technology to the brain, as laser technology has already been applied to neurosurgery and eye surgery, and it is possible to eliminate tumors in the brain using resonant sonic frequencies. Thus, there is much hope for the future of neuroscience, which remains today a largely pharmacological field, and little attention paid to the curriculum vitae of thoughts our minds accumulate, except by advertisers, who are responsible for most of our man-made sensory stimuli. According to a doctor named Timothy Leary, who studied states of consciousness relative to the evolution of human cognition, there are 8 primary circuits, or engrams, that are predetermined levels of awareness associated with the timed function of genetic adaptation, where the survival instinct is inherent to the single nerve and where survival of the fittest is considered the only governing principle. The first is the biosurvival sense, often called consciousness, which evolved 2 to 3 billion years ago with the rise of invertebrates and remains visible in the individual human at the stage of infancy. Here, an either-or circuit establishes itself that will govern most of the rest of the third-dimensionally relative habitual patterns of survival. This determines the mechanism of approach, nurturing helpful things, avoid noxious, dangerous things. This is water. The second is the emotional sense, or ego, beginning 500 million years ago with the birth of mammals, and becomes apparent for the individual human at the stage of upright walking, both due to the start of competition for territory. This activates the up-down binary circuit. This is air. The third is dexterity symbolism sense, or mind, arising 4 to 5 million years ago when hominids entered the Paleolithic age and began making stone tools, and is equivalent for the individual with the developmental stage of using toys, tools, and weapons. Also, the beginning of speech for the toddler as well as the early human branch of the primate family tree is credited to this neurogenetic encoding. It activates the left-right circuit of dominant handedness. This is Earth. Fourth is the sociosexual sense, which awakened for mankind 32,000 years ago when the first hominids penetrated India, and is found in the puberty of the individual person. This is thought to also be the first beginning of civilization, for it is associated with hunting in packs among animals. This is fire. Fifth is the neurosomatic sense, and it is first to occur in the right hemisphere. Leary, drawn towards both scholasticism and the populace of the student class, balanced the scale of controversially ascribing the use of certain different psychoactive drugs, some illegal at the time, for the extension of the sense of self into these different conditions of intellect, with the staunchly authoritarian doctrine of the division of the brain into functional areas. One of Leary's students, Stan Groff, holds a view of the brain as a holomnemonic whole, which he calls holotropic, perhaps in apology for his predecessor's antiquarian affiliations. This sense of the creative hemisphere, which we only seem to send electrical currents through while on certain chemical substances, was first activated 4,000 years ago, and distinguishes the difference between visual Euclidean space and sensory multidimensional space. This is gravity. The sixth sense is neuroelectric and is 2,500 years old. In this condition, the nervous system becomes actively aware of itself, and free will determines our way through different tonal realities, each leading to its own goal, by metaprogramming. This is commonly associated with anomalous cognition or extrasensory perception. It allows comprehension of the magnetic force and electron scale. This is the electromagnetic force. Seventh is the neurogenetic, which is 2,200 years old. It is associated with the concepts of reincarnation, immortality, past life memories, as well as with the akashic records and the collective unconscious. Here we discover the marvels of our own cellular deoxyribonucleic acids, and inherit control of the mechanism by which these senses have become activated, namely free will, governed by the survival instinct, in a game reality, the only rule of which is survival of the fittest. This is the force of nuclear fusion. The last is the neuroatomic sense, associated with astral projection, out-of-body experiences, lucid dreaming, and remote viewing. When this sense becomes aware, we gain access in our mind's eye to perception of the behavior of particles and waves on a quantum level, as we are actually thinking about what we are thinking, and discover by doing so that our thoughts are subatomic electrical impulses inside the neurocellular columns of the gray matter of our brains. This is the force of nuclear fission. The philosophy Leary used this marvelously open-minded and broad-sweeping data to justify was, however, cyberpunk, a lifestyle unaccepted by the community yet today. It is clear that this was in keeping with the agenda of the same level of thinkers as released the comic book-inspired movie The Matrix, which equates metaphysicians with terrorists in the eyes of a predatory authority. Leary himself recognized that we are, all of us humans on planet Earth that is, involved in a war between the levels of this hierarchy. I would only go so far as to add that I believe it is, in essence, a war over whether or not we will be allowed to manifest. I have listed, along with these, the relative elements. Cosmos, or spirit, moves into and passes through this system. There are centers for souls to gather that have not yet been locked down by the institutionalized religious system. These are called the Traveling Lodge. They have been described in publicized occult literature since the medieval Rosicrucians. Now they are associated by the populace with such sites as crop circles and possible UFO crash sites such as Roswell. The true Traveling Lodge bears more similarity to the brainwashing cult of Rosalind Air Force Base. However, such truths will never be pursued. This demonstrates the difference between what is known esoterically and what may be revealed exoterically. For reasons that are extremely personal to the initiated, it is important for the air-space craft that humans fly to be of human design. The fact that the United States Air Force was formed in the same year as the Roswell crash, and that some of its oldest ongoing projects involve stealth technology, all acute angles, thus deflecting fewer radar waves, beginning with the flying wing and culminating in the V-wing B-2 bomber, only shows that humans could have studied extraterrestrial flight technology, but proves that all of the technology they have produced is inherently human, having been designed and built by normal people, and having been carried through from beginning to end by human hands. It is in this way that the actual government-classified vehicles, those designed by human beings of today, can fly about today right before our very eyes. The black helicopters are also the product of stealth technology. They use scalar wave sound mufflers that can be used for mind control. Similarly, the Northrop TR-3A Black Manta is a triangle shape because it uses 3 microwave gravity generators to expand a wormhole and break the light barrier, while the public of today is unaware that this craft can even leave the atmosphere. There are, however, several possible designs and methods available for it to do so. A double rocket propulsion system is commonly used by NASA to send the space shuttle into orbit. However, this is little more than a freight vessel rented out to the highest bidding multinational conglomerates for putting their satellite into space or doing some worthless waste of research or development, more for a public relations show than for pure science. The rule of society is ruled by the law, where justice is only what can be proven, and where it is easy enough for those with money to determine which version of reality there will be evidence for. In this way, all actual UFOs and extraterrestrial encounters are usually counted among the number of intentional human frauds, and in this way sneak off the radar out of the public eye. These crafts are only our future selves, returning to our shared home planet in time machines, just as we have been doing since the sudden and as yet unexplained appearance of our species. As I have described, the USAF have contributed greatly to the number of identified flying objects that defy what we expect for earthbound aircrafts. However, they were not the first to do so. Orville and Wilbur Wright, the two brother co-owners of a bicycle shop, built the first human aircraft in recorded history as recently as the 19th century. Unidentified flying objects date back to the beginning of this same history and are recorded all throughout the texts of time. Cigar-shaped scalar wave weather balloons were the first modern UFOs, appearing in the skies of the late 1800s, although they may have originated later during the 1950s weather balloon experimentation phase of the USAF and slid backward in time as an effect of the scalar waves distorting the temporal synchronicity of the balloon's molecular frequencies. The German National Socialists were probably the first people to propel a rocket into space, and as they were responsible for all the early solid fuel propulsion systems used to break Earth's gravity. It is known that they had access to scalar wave technology, although because most of their research and development facilities were bombed during World War II, which they started and lost, it is unknown much of what their application projects with scalar wave technology might have been. Nikola Tesla, who first invented scalar wave technology around the turn of the 20th century and applied it to a death ray that was directed through the surface of the Earth and which was responsible for devastating Tunguska, Russia, claimed to be in contact with off-world sources. Another group that would make a similar claim was the Golden Dawn, who associated with the legacy of the true and invisible College of Rosicrucianism by way of the secret chiefs of the Great White Brotherhood of illumined seers and ascended masters. The Russians, contemporary to the Americans, developed both solid fuel rockets propulsion systems and scalar wave technology. Because the two superpowers' competition was to dominate their entire drive and motivation for research and development, both countries suffered down to the lowest common denominator of weapons manufacture. While intercontinental ballistic missiles became a new reality, both sides directed enormous scalar wave programs against one another and against themselves for mind control of the mass populace. The Russians were the first to put a probe in orbit around the Earth that sent a radio signal back to the ground, and they were the first to put a man in space, that is, in a pod outside the atmosphere, and they retrieved him happily. The Americans were the first to land on and return a man from the moon, however. Because of superior Japanese manufactured broadcast media, were able to make this seem like a bigger accomplishment. This competition between the two greatest nations in all the land did not end until while I was a child, and I can attest to the stress that this Cold War produced for me even then. What I am about to describe is best done in space. Doing so on Earth, on any large scale, is probably contraindicated. This is not to say that this has not been done before, and yet we are still alive. It is simply that myths of a strange energy source are associated with the downfall of an ancient lost super-civilization. Mythology is a strange beast in itself. It is usually only a court jester's perspective on the affairs of the court and health of the royal family. However, when it speaks of the human ability to harness energy that can be misused, even if accidentally, to cause a massive effect, it addresses one of the greater issues of the human species. This being said, by projecting a faster microwave frequency into a slower microwave tachyon. It is possible to expand this tachyon into a wormhole by mapping scalar wave frequencies over top of the microwave signal. It is possible to access any destination from the holographic electromagnetic radiation background. This can be done as easily as by projecting a visual thought of where you want to go onto the wormhole. When the destination is projected by whatever medium, mechanical or biological, it creates a particular harmony with the faster microwave gravity, and this creates null space or zero-point energy, the electromagnetic result of combining radiation and gravity. Another name for this is a temporal singularity. Just as the background radiation of the electromagnetic spectrum serves as a fractal through which any single point in space may be linked to any other, so does the sum over histories of probabilities in the universe serve as the gnomon from which we may extract our temporal destinations. Once you have traveled through a wormhole, you have entered into the multiverse. Things will not be the same, and all things will continually change. It is possible to meet yourself in this way, and there are few experiences more alienating from reality. Wormholes are like wishing wells. Wishing you were home from a wormhole is like falling down a probability well. Many people in the present and near future will find this to be true, because if you wish you weren't brought before the Most High, then lo, you will be cast down. So it is with hyperspace. If you try to turn it inside out and use it to get where you already are, it will put you down in another time. Paranoia is a kind of insurance paid out in karma. The prevalence of evidence shows us beyond equivalence that the full extent of advancement in the natural sciences and in technology of ancient, lost civilizations is now beyond our comprehension. Every artifact in existence seems to add a stroke to the blank canvas, painting a picture of humanity as a more and more adaptatively developed species at an earlier and earlier time, far from wandering blindly before the creation of civilization, which, according to scholars, is barely a second ago on the smallest cog of the cosmic clock. The modern time traveler, a historian in this case, exploring the past, can now carry with them all the artifacts essential to survival throughout the lifetime of humanity. There can be no doubt that ancient civilizations, such as the early dynastic Chinese and the Mayan, evolved highly complicated calendrical systems based on astronomical observations that modern scholars think would have required modern computers to calculate. However, there is a building amount of evidence to indicate that even the localized tribes who remained technologically primitive, such as the Aborigines and the Dogon, also possessed this level of astronomical knowledge. It is perhaps easier to imagine a more complex civilization discovering more complex data. However, since people of all lands and affiliations possessed the same skill, it can only be explained by a highly evolved common source. This point of origin is in our future. Ancient ruins are all that remain of what we will have built in the past. The technology of today can get you to yesterday through tomorrow. The mind, when seen as a holographic imprint overlaying the brain, created by the brain, is seen to exist in a continuum unique from that of the fleshly body. There are billions of interacting neurons in the brain, each comprised of a fiber that delivers an electrical signal and connected by gaps crossed by neurotransmitters. If you could take the mind out of the brain, as John Dee extrapolated his angelic host from the four elements, it would be comprised of an asymptotically infinite number of such connections. However, it would no longer be responsible for triggering the nervous signals to the body. It could be transferred into an electrical machine or into the ambient electromagnetic field or the microwave background radiation. It is really irrelevant where it goes outside the body. These connections are thought to be the wells from which emotions arise, and so we must see that our mind goes with our emotions. People in times of yore romanticized about their feelings coming from the heart, but modern biology's guess is the brain. The nerves in this way spread throughout the system of the entire body, and so the phantom sensation of the entire form may come along. This has been rigorously researched, from primitive natural birthing and early Tantra yoga to modern advanced pharmaceutical experimentation on animals and by people on themselves, all of which is, in all honesty, unethical, only in that it is pro-entropic. Atlantis is a timed utopia. You could travel back on one day, live there a year, and arrive back in the present the next day. Assuming that you established a temporal signature by returning to the same timeline in such a way, that is, by being in one timeline day after day and being gone in between these days for undefined durations, then you would establish a referential evolutionary cue to determine lifespan. This would be an artificial temporal pattern. However, once one enters the multiverse, there is no going back to the way things were before. So higher natural and new artificial patterns alone can serve as moral compass there. When navigating the time stream, it is much like an electrical impulse traveling upon nerves, and this experience stays with a person such that it is difficult to know when it has fully stopped and when one has arrived at their destination, because the gravity to which this disorientation is relative to is time, or the forward flow of entropy defined by the spin of a photon measured as the speed of light. While society appears like a giant dinosaur to culture, culture appears like a microscopic fly to society. Culture is the poor man's society. There is no such thing as an exclusively bourgeois fraternal order, unless related to a job, like police officers. The star system of America establishes a new royal class, comprised of entertainers, models, and news anchors. This is the sum and substance of modern American culture, the gift of the 1950s plastic fantastic suburbanites, their simulacrum of historical heritage as it existed before our forefathers established our more perfect than thou union with the social compact. This era of free thinkers who were Jacobite Masons from Rousseau to Castro, including Washington, were trying to tear the social middle class away from rule by a lord of the land. In America, in the 1950s, the middle class were housed in suburbs surrounding the cities in which they worked in high-rise offices. The social destiny that had been given to them they had made manifest with great skyscrapers. Most countries have a folk wisdom founded culture that dates back much further than modern American culture. American culture did not even begin on an international scale until the 1950s, when industrialized manufacturing made our production of stylized consumer goods applicable to the mass market of the entire world, and the new technological communication media were first used to introduce international cultural trade into the global free market of ideas. The only reason I go into the society and culture of America is that it is a young nation that has grown rapidly to become a globally recognized economy and political system. Human cultures have grown with human migrational patterns and evolved from the same origins differently in different regions. Society, on the other hand, derives from the tribal hierarchy of chief and medicine man, and from the first codification of law in Sumer at the same time as the beginning of a written record of history, which was simply a generally binding agreement to provide services to one another. Society did not begin until people were spread throughout the world and had already established what would become their traditional cultural customs. Society formed in two camps, the Middle Eastern and the Indian. The Middle Eastern rule has been passed to us directly in the form of the Ten Commandments. The Indian rule established the class system. There can be little doubt that, while the samurai warriors of later Japan, who are thought to be inheritors of an originally Indian cultural heritage, represent a totalitarian or dictatorial, though essentially otherwise classless, society, the class system of India spread to the West and influenced the minds of even the early Greek philosophers, considered to be the first social politicians, as opposed to laborers or lords, and it was upon the framework of a class hierarchy that the first utopias were speculated. This would lead to the Roman Empire conquering Europe, and Christianity, the idea of the anthropomorphic deity as discorporeal father figure, conquering the entire Western Hemisphere. Insofar as it was cultural, Christianity spread to the East as well, though this caused a split in the Church over the doctrine of the Trinity in the West and that of the ascended human in the East. In the West, the class system would evolve through the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, with America arising as the synthesis of a capitalist free market and a representative democratic republic. What we can conclude from this is that culture moves eastward around our planet, while society moves westward. First of all, let me assure you that there are no aliens walking the earth at this time, nor have there been at any time during our recorded history. There has not been any genetic interbreeding. There is no technology that was not made by humans on the planet, nor has there ever been. No one else controls our fate. Human beings have free will, and this controls all human outcomes. It alone always has. What have been called fairies, elves, goblins, or monsters throughout history, particularly among the fairy tales of the European Middle Ages, are usually only either wishful anthropomorphication of natural forces and events, or actually deformed people forced to live outside of town due to scientific misunderstanding. But these are definitively not exclusively extraterrestrial forces. no matter how alien they may have seemed to people. Similarly, the concept of the jinn, or discorporeal ghosts, probably the hallucinations caused by drinking the first artificial alcohols, as well as the elemental pantheons, should both indicate to us that the Anunnaki of the Sumerians, who came in vehicles from the sky, probably refers to events of weather or astronomy, and should not be taken as entirely and exclusively a literal description. Another example of such a vehicle that appears from the air is given by Ezekiel and recorded in the Bible. However, a technologically advanced time machine from our future or a drug-induced experience could both account for this as well. More recently, the reports of alien abductions all involve beings that are thin and gray with large heads, large black eyes, and small mouths. Visual hallucinations of such beings, presumably doctors during a birth experience flashback, have been documented as being produced by the strong electromagnetic fields given off near areas of tectonic pressure, such as fault lines and volcanoes. It is likely that the original inspiration for beings of this appearance was that of the earliest mummified corpses, who look like the state between health and the skull. Natural mummies, such as the one frozen in ice on a mountaintop, and some of those buried in the peat bogs of England, date back to the last ice age and to the Stone Age. The concept of the jinn, whose astral realm is the motivator, source, and intersection of the four elemental forces, introduces the applicability of transdimensionality, as the ghosts of the dead are thought to be beyond time. Whether such spirits exist or not, it is clear that they would exist according to rules that would not be confined to the earth. Being beyond even necessity of incarnation, such concentrated intelligences are immortal within the universe of the four forces. They may be raised on the sounds of the sunspots and solar flares, and heard in the Earth's electromagnetic field. But the realm of the jinn is hyperdimension, the same as that accessed by wormholes. The jinn have been seen by various world religions as the peaceful angels and the wrathful demons, who inhabit the same heavens as the spirits and ghosts of the dead. In the same pages of the first record of the jinn are descriptions of human giants and men of renown who were of the first generation following human interaction with the ethereal spirits. It is from these people that we derive all the subsequent arts of metaphysics, mysticism, and magic. They were the first to be alienated by their communities, and this is why these arts are secret. It is difficult, often, to address the cause of something if it generates many and or various different types of effect. It is tempting to rhetoricians to focus too much on examining the differences between effects than to cut to the core of their common cause, particularly if the cause arises as only one of a greater number of possible outcomes itself. However, it is in fact much more fruitful to study the cycle of time that allows the harvest than to simply reap the rewards of nature's workings. This is illustrated by Jesus in a parable as the difference between feeding a man a fish and teaching him to fish. Because of this proclivity of the analytical mind, a single ongoing cause may remain undiscovered for any finite number of effects throughout time, even while each of these effects is studied in detail by specialists. Such is the case today with the effects on third-dimensional material forms caused by their interaction with higher dimensions. The best, or at least most immediately prevalent, example for this is the mystery of death caused by third-dimensional spatial interaction with the fourth temporal dimension. We believe that death is an inevitable end of any and all forms or patterns of matter that exchange energy with their surrounding environment. However, by this criteria, the fact that life exists at all is an unprecedented miracle, since the fragile biological organism is an engine for energy exchange that functions at ratios equivalent in other physical bodies with much shorter lifespans. In fact, the biological form of life is that which has been chosen by survival of the fittest attributes of atomic chemistry to exist in direct opposition to death. This is proved by our species being the only one with a working concept of finite time. On the most open scope, all that exists is the interaction of dimensions. The matter energy we call the third dimension is the effect of the presence of time. Down to the first dimensional singularity well in a brain, plane, or event field of space-time, we see that the known dimensions are entirely interdependent, and so we must allow that this be true for any number more dimensions that might exist undiscovered. When we imagine these dimensions as distanced from one another, such as the measure given by whole numbers, they comprise the multiverse, each potential universe with a different vibrational set of laws of physics relative to its neighbors. When we imagine these dimensions all bunched up close to one another, as with the measure given by fractions between whole numbers, they comprise hyperdimension, each different dimension distorted with its own unique underlying geometry. Some vibrational frequencies are beneficial to the life of the microorganisms that comprise the fibers of our genes. Others are harmful. The same common knowledge is associated with the modern folk wisdom of pregnant mothers putting small speakers playing music upon the outside of their growing uterus to expose the fetus, while still developing as an embryo in the womb, to the external world's sensory stimuli. This is thought to enhance the baby's appreciation for composition later in its adult life. The beneficial vibrations of electromagnetic radiation, which includes the visible spectrum and is of a similar form to sound waves, are those equal to the angstroms of the gene that tend to encourage or advance it along its existing pattern of growth. Also, just as lasers can now be used for cutting, the right frequency of light can aid in the splicing of different genetic fragments and activation of different inherent traits while they are still alive in the cells. Harmful frequencies are all the rest of the frequencies that do not exactly match the criteria of the existing measurements of the genes. It is the sad truth that the lifeline followed by our genetic sequences and sequencers, birth, mate, death, the same holographic pattern we follow in our own lives, is more influenced by these negative influences than by the scarcer positive ones, but only according to the statistics, which show that all things that are born die, but that only as many things are born as mates have found each other to parent them, and that fewer things find mates than are born. the result of exposure only to those frequencies which stimulate our growth as a genetically unique species would be an appearance similar to that which people appear to have to a person being exposed to those frequencies. This has been described by people living near the electromagnetic fields in flux between the geophysical friction of a fault line, and I have already mentioned it in the section on the hallucinatory appearance of aliens. There remains a debate about the mind over whether it is more ethereal or substantive, and this debate has gone on for almost as long as there have been minds to debate with about minds in the first place. However, when considering the effects of radiation exposure, nowhere is the line more clearly drawn between the two opposing concepts. We see that the debate hinges upon the concepts of ether manifesting, motivating, matter, and matter representing, reflecting, ether. The earlier argument is then usually called moral or ethical, though it is really impossible according to matter energy, and the latter obfuscated by the division between the body and the brain when it is really moral or ethical. At the two polarized ends of the argument are the concepts of mind as ethereal, eternal spirit, or as the mortal self-cognition of organic matter. In truth, it is the biological circuit which is the temptation, though anyone subject to natural law will eventually find themselves having believed in both. When the brain itself is exposed to electromagnetic radiation, it has different effects according to the different wavelengths of the vibrational frequencies. Very short wavelength, high-frequency microwaves of the scale of the diameter of a single electron cloud penetrate to the inner neuron pillars and columns of the cerebellum, as well as to the holographic neural electric projection tissue of the thalamus, stimulating quantum fluctuation there, and thus increasing the kinetic potential of the brain overall. That is, it stimulates thoughts. However, microwave frequencies of a slightly longer wavelength, that of the diameter of a nucleus or an atom, will disintegrate the brain tissue at an atomic scale. One method of introducing electromagnetic fields into the brain is by creating a gravity band or gravity well, and it is known that magnetic elements were used in the creation of some Mayan crowns, possibly for the purpose of elongation of the wearer's skull. The thoughts that arise in the environment of the mind, in the context of the ego or the recognition of self, due to exposure to electromagnetic radiation, are similar to those induced with certain psychotropic or psychoactive chemical substances, and this is not surprising, since the brain, along with the entire nervous system, is an electrochemical hydraulic turbine. These thoughts are usually distortions to the type of sensations our sensory organs ordinarily perceive. It is usually thoughts such as these that are associated with mystical experiences of the ethereal spirit, and therefore the primary goal of adapting to them is the differentiation of fact from fiction. Changing is an ending of one thing and the beginning of another, and everything is forever changing. In this context, you cannot hold on to anything, and may even let go of your sense of self, for it can only serve to anchor your soul to one region in space-time. Here is where we experience the astral body of the free spirit. This is the idea of the second self, and even it can be shed for the greater light. Permanence is an ending of changes, the fixing of all potential future histories for a subject into singular form. It is associated with the edifying of idea. However, it is hypothesized that, insofar as it cannot be accomplished artificially, it can be accomplished naturally at least as well. This amounts to the idiom, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, which refers to the original creation of our internal carbon compounds in the nuclear furnace of the sun, and to the continual radioactive decay of carbon element 14 in all living and once living things. Thus, we see that both change and permanence constitute their own form of ending, change being the ever-ending of everything, and permanence the end of change. When we begin to see time as the history of a wormhole, the measure of the moments will be infinitely changing parallel universes. These are equivalent to the infinitely different possible outcomes in the potential of every event probability well. Thus, each different possible universe measures as the intersection of two distinct dimensions, infinite depth within and infinite length in sequence. Inside the wormhole history of time, we experience temporal gravity towards the past, where our memories tie the ego down to the experiences of material reality in the present moment and invert these into concerns, intellectual and emotional, for the ego's future. However, this is no more than a sign of the times, erected into the free-fall limbo of the future. It is used as a guidepost and for ascension, and is the subject of gospel and gossip and derision. As I have said before, our concerns for the future of what we believe to be ourselves are irrelevant relative to death. This does not mean people don't think that these two things go together. On the upside, by letting go of the constraints tying one to the sensation of the here and now, it is possible for the center of awareness to rise up into the future. With no fixed focal point for the self in the temporal continuum, one can explore, detached, wherever they will. At this point, we can stop time, fast forward, rewind, do all these things within our minds. Meanwhile, an infinite number of possible options surround us at all times, populating the multiverse with pathways connecting to singularities like us. Singularities, like all things, are attracted to one another, temporal and gravitational both and alike, and so the wormholes comprise potential histories between these points. To be drawn into and caught up by this web is to be beyond the reaches of time. Singularities are permanent, more or less, relative to one another, and wormholes only connect them as long as they are apart. The only equivalent concept to permanent time distortion, or time-space disorientation, is the concept of hypersleep, the sleep of ages. In this, the subject's body is put into unconsciousness in suspended animation and reawakened, usually many light years later. A parallel theme to this is that of post-mortem cryogenic preservation and resurrection, or even the potential extrapolations of transplanting. It is a popular saying among metaphysicians that the only way out is through. This is a half-truth, and unlike many of my colleagues, I do not wish to appear false or misleading. It is generally accepted that the only way to the singularity is through the wormholes, and the singularity itself is the doorway out of the universe and its internal, ever-expanding, multi-dimensional multiverse. However, going through it leads into the baby universe created outside the universe by the alignment of the temporal singularity wormholes as they feed the substance and laws of physics from the parent universe to the child. To come to grips with the popular misconception of getting out by going through, we must extrapolate what is indicated from what is observed. In this case, we see that as a body travels through the wormholes inside the event horizon of a black hole and outside the singularity at its core, it is divided by the temporal singularities it passes through on its way between them to the central gravitational singularity, according to the law of infinitely repeating halves. Thus, what is apparently theorized by the esteemed past scholars is that to finally exit the universe and the expanding multidimensional multiverse it contains, one must first pass through an infinite number of baby universes containing smaller black holes. As ritualized and formalized as this doctrine has become in the modern occult, it really amounts to little more than this. While there is an absurd consensus, in light of naked singularities, that to get to a singularity it is necessary to travel through quantum foam with random quantum fluctuations caused by the uncertainty principle, the wormholes, it is generally not considered to move temporally perpendicular to the history of the singularity after entering into the realm of microwave gravitational tachyon YLM. Archetypes are trans-temporal. They exist throughout time. Commonly, they are called stereotypes, and, while valued, also made the subject of much abuse. The name archetype is a crude play on words, doubling the arc of the rainbow with the Ark of the Covenant. The true ideological entity this asymptote of meaning describes is perhaps better thought of these days as a messaliangel, a triple play on the words messenger, in that it transports information, alien, in that it is not confined to the earth, and angel, in that it is spiritual and ideal in essence. Perhaps the reason that stereotypes are so abused as a social statistic is the ongoing debate between the body and brain and between the mind and spirit. They represent a blending of the self-identity with some greater purpose as their guide, and thus make highly recognizable minorities and often two totalitarian majorities. The people who do not wish to be seen as stereotypes, on the other hand, see themselves as being somehow more spiritual and thusly more righteous. The truth is that, as long as there is analytical observation, nothing can remain long unclassified. Social movements, usually themselves the cumulative effect of combined social, political, and economic factors that give rise to these stereotypes as connections along the grapevine joining mainstream and underground culture, are thought constructs of information systemization that naturally organize these statistical aggregates into relationship with one another. It is because of the imagined similarity between social institutions coagulating stereotypes and seraphic hosts and orders of angels, and the jinn, that they are thought to be justified. It should be worth noting that these social institutions and classification of orders of archetypes began at the same time and in the same place as the institutionalizations of state and church. However, besides that, they are literally as different as these meta-entities. The angels, demons, spirits, and ghosts thought to populate the afterlife are all either originally anthropomorphications of discorporeal forces or founded on the personal memories of departed ancestors. The synthesis of these two realms is the key of all religion, and it continues to remain a struggle in the minds of holy men today. In the Far East, where Shinto is prevalent, the people believe that even the trees have guardian spirits, and Buddhism shows how the soul passes from one body to the next on a journey towards ascension into the primary clear light. In the Middle East and Europe, they have made equally complicated explanations, unifying the realm of the forces and that of pure consciousness, without a living shell. In the West, the various religions of the Native Americans succeed best at understanding that these two underworlds are one, and the rest focus on extraterrestrials and the apocalypse. None of these clearly specify or agree as to the exact details of the nature of an archetype. Using elements from all the existing systems, as we see that we must do, since these are temporal systems and archetypes are trans-temporal, an archetype might best be described as a reincarnating, hollow-mnemonic, interpersonal, social mold. It is reincarnating in that it transcends its representative manifestations into the eternal duration of ideal or potential. It does this from moment to moment, event to event, stereotype to stereotype, and so gradually taking every possible road in the garden of forking paths, tracing out its parent pattern like pixels on a TV screen. In this way, it is imitating the holographic behavior of photons in the double-slit experiment. Here we see that the individual photons themselves follow the same fractal crystallization, in this case binary, being equally likely to pass through either slit, as a hologram, wherein each part carries potential for the pattern of the whole field. However, the difference between a fractal and a gnomon is that a fractal has a closed or finite set of parameters, and a gnomon has an open set. Therefore, all fractals are self-terminating in the course of their permutations. However, gnomons continue to replicate exponentially. Because our human population grows in this same way, as I have said, opposite the curve of death, the gnomon is thought to represent a more lifelike form of mathematical expansion. Thus, to say that archetypes are hollow-mnemonic implies that their existence is in some way more like our own than otherwise. Insofar as it is relative in fields, the archetype is commutative in the same way that humans communicate interpersonally. We cross gaps between one another with our ideas, and in this same way, a particle, such as a photon, transmits a force from one event location in space-time to another. Thus, also, matter and energy, though in versions of one another, are both subject to interaction temporally. We see that the more we interact with others, the more affirmed we feel that all is one. Society is but a vague shadow cast by the desire to preserve a deteriorating knowledge of an ancient technology, which is based on the science of time. It is hints of this great light that peek through now and then to bestow revelations and spiritual experiences that foster, engender, and encourage systemizations. These are only glimpses by the left hemisphere of the potential for reunion with the right. Archetypes are artificial. Stereotypes are man-made, copyrighted, advertised, and merchandised every day, and so, it is thought, God controls the angels. Einstein, one of the greatest minds to grace this globe, said, "God does not roll dice." Man is given free will, but this right is reserved for him alone, as punishment, along with death. The angels have no rights of their own, and the demons have no release. This little bit of metaphysical legislation sounds about accurate as the result of millennia of human relations. It leaves a lot to be said for the description of the actual conditions of archetypes, as I have described them by unifying their attributes. What we are seeing with our eyes are photons. They enter through the lens, reorient the rods and cones, and are translated into electrochemical signals in the nerves connecting the eyes to the brain. Photons are real particles that transmit radiation from a source to a receiver. It takes different amounts of time for a photon to travel different distances, since all photons travel at, relatively, the same speed, known as the speed of light. A photon reflecting from the surface of a flower to our eye and carrying a distortion to its wavelength that translates as the flower's colors travels across that distance almost immediately. It would have taken that same photon 6 minutes to get from the surface of the sun to where it was reflected off the surface of the flower. It takes light 100 million of Earth's years to travel across our galaxy, and about 11 to 15 billion light years to get to Earth from the furthest edges of the known universe. What we are seeing in the night sky, for example, is not the light given off by the stars as we are watching them, but the light they gave off millions and millions of years ago. Therefore, it is not exactly accurate to consider anything that photons are conveying to our eyes as reliably real. Just as the one color wavelength the flower reflects is the only one it didn't absorb, so are the very heavens above an illusion. Samsara is a recursive cycle of events. Most of the populace is given blindly and bodily over to samsara. We learn what behaviors are appropriate and what not, and eventually become completely distracted by our own lives. Then there are those who leave samsara. Of these, some leave only to return again. Of these, some return and forget, and some return and remember. A few leave completely. Of these, most leave at the moment of death. The only humans known to have transcended samsara while still alive all became great teachers and healers, because only those outside samsara can change it, and only those who are completely free of it can guide the rest of the populace closer to its conclusion. In samsara, though, everyone thinks they are a fit guide. This is how they forget their own suffering. When suffering is ignored, it worsens. When internal suffering worsens, it becomes external suffering. For Buddhists, only the trance of nirvana can free us from external suffering. Then, in the trances of samadhi and samasamadhi, one sees their own internal suffering, and, by seeing it, can pass through it, for it is only an illusion. In the trance of nirvana, one sees the veil of external suffering as well, and, by seeing it, can pass through it, for it, too, is only an illusion. Suffering is an illusion because it occurs to the self. The self is an illusion. Both the self and its sufferings, or what comprise samsara, are an illusion of time. As time passes, events change, and within these events are physical patterns, such as ourselves, trees, computers, etc. When events change, these change, causing patterns of event for physical forms over time. Samsara is a very specific such cycle of events that applies on a wide scale because it governs very general patterns. It has been known of since the creation of civilization and has existed at least since the birth of consciousness. There is no way of knowing whether or not, say, an electron suffers in its orbit around a nucleus, or whether the stars can know that they are doomed. It has been hypothesized that, according to the law of natural similarities, the consciousness by which we know samsara is probably a pattern that we have found in other forms, so it is possible that the suffering is of the pattern, and that consciousness is the mechanism by which to pass through external suffering without internal suffering. The trances used by Buddhists are methods of concentrating consciousness so that one can see the physical pattern of their own existence as the source of internal suffering, and perceive that they are more than this alone, and see the cycling pattern of existent events as the source of external suffering, and perceive that the universe is more than this alone, and, in so doing, find peace. The pattern of samsara is quite simple. Two forms of it are the Buddhist wheel of becoming and the hexagrams of the I Ching. You should notice that the wheel has spherical application and the hexagrams have cubical application. This only arises because the mind, the source of both forms, is represented as the sphere inside the cube, where consciousness occurs as a point shared by the sphere and the cube. The sphere is an infinity of thoughts, and the cube is the 5 senses and the 6 fundamentals of reasoning. This shape is representative of a phi over pi spiral, the sphere being pi-bound, and the phi being extractable from the cube as the height of one of the tetrahedrons it contains if the leg of the cube is 1 unit, or as a flat spiral on the surface of half of any one of its sides. This is the universally occurring pattern that has been postulated for consciousness, or the pattern of concentration of mind over time. By applying this pattern to the wheel of becoming and the I Ching, we can see how simple the pattern of events called samsara actually is. In the I Ching, there are 8 trigrams that compose the 64 hexagrams, and consequently there are 8 double or inverse hexagrams, which look the same above and below. These 8 are the corners of the cube. The sides of the cube are the 6 lokas, or realms of reincarnation, between the spokes of the wheel of becoming. Yet these cardinal directions are 8, when taken with the ascending and descending paths through them, and 10 when counted with consciousness at the center, and time, the mandala's outline. The 8 trigrams can be arranged either according to the early heaven or later heaven arrangements. The proper arrangement for the 8 doubled hexagrams is determined by a pattern that balances their numerical values from the context of the King Wen sequence of 64 hexagrams given in the mandala of time. The 8 trigrams usually represent characteristics that govern the 8 events represented by the 8 doubles. What is described by samsara is the fluctuation of a field of energy. The 64 hexagrams represent the regular functioning of this field, represented by their first order of difference, or number of Tao lines changed between them, and the 8 doubles, the regular fluctuation, or wobble, within that function, similar to precession. The inventors of the I Ching called this energy Qi, and housed it within Tao, meaning the way. Another way of expressing it would be to call the energy potential and the Tao probability. Here we see that probability is the substance of time. Regardless of how we describe the states of others that dwell before God, we describe ourselves as having souls that become spirits when they are raised before the Lord. This has been described variously by all the different institutionalized religious cultures, and it is a belief that traces its roots back to the birth of the jinn and civilization. In the Far East, the internal energy, or Qi, is studied as it flows in the Kundalini path through the chakras and manifold pressure centers, generating the person's karmic aura, visible when they open the ajna, or third eye. In the Middle East, the Hebrews study the Ruach and Neshama in the context of the 4 worlds of action, formation, creation, and emanation. Christianity expands upon this esoterically by way of astral travel and indulgences, and the Muslims offer grand promises of paradise beyond death. The Native Americans in the North and South continent, even as far as the westernmost islands of Oceania, believe in a force called mana or Maya, which is responsible for all things, and is the substance of the power that the gods have over the heavens and nature, and by which they affect the laws of men through their appointed administrators. The subtle distinction between the soul and the spirit has been argued philosophically for equally as long, and insanity and intent are the equivalent modern legalese. According to current legislations, the letter of the law is replaced by plea bargaining, and the spirit of the law revolves around proving preconception. All this means in straight talk is that modern pop culture media, whose target market is rebellious teens, is itself the child of election politics and national populist religion, and that protection of the inherent human trait of free will is guaranteed by written law in the American Constitution. Pop culture represents the golden dawn of artificial intelligence, the media itself replacing the soul, or link between the astral and material realms, and the spirit becoming a simulacrum, body without organs, in virtual reality, possessed of the absolute, dictatorial freedom to impose the full limits of their will upon the seeming substance and the very essence of their environment. As I have described in the context of hyperdimension, pure mathematical geometry underlies the laws of physics. It has long been held that pure math is on a different level of reality, that of pure ideal, for it can be done even in the context of only the mind. Dreaming was thought to be the degeneration of meaning of mental images from this realm when it was first conceived. Thus it was thought that the soul descends from this realm, like a dream, while the spirit raises upward toward it. This is that shell for consciousness that acts as the umbilical cord connecting the soul to the earthly environment. When we die, this cord is cut, and our spirit is born into the next world. This world after death is thought to be the ethereal astral realm, that of the ideal, where exist, distilled to their essentials, all patterns that give rise to shape in manifest forms. Just as the body manipulates objects on the terrestrial plane, so does the free spirit apprehend and shape ideas from the astral ether. However, when the body dies and the spirit leaves it for the last time, it does not die completely. The spark of life remains in the form of the genetic coding of the body's DNA and the ambient electromagnetic signature that it accumulates in life. The result of this is seen in the continued growth of hair and nails after death, caused by the aura's afterimage, stimulating the tougher follicles and tissue to progress along the lifeline's patterns of growth, and in the decay of radiocarbon-14, which acts as an electromagnetic pulse, the only radioactive element present in organic matter, and thus serving as both an elemental frequency and a biorhythm. In this way, even the dead are not dead, only waiting for their voices carried on their continuing frequencies to be listened to and understood. The secret doctrine of the Therapeutai, contemporaries of the Pythagoreans of early Greece, is that ultimately it is better for man to die at the hands of man than through the intervention of illness. Thus they began the practice of deriving medicines from poisons in order to treat fire with explosion, and therefore ensure different effects of preservation of the corpse after death, with drugs that treat incurable diseases with death. This continued on through the Roman Empire, when lead, a deadly toxin that assists in post-mortem preservation by killing off the bacterial microorganisms that line the walls of the intestines, was used to line aqueducts and thus taint the public drinking water supply. Lead-based medicines continued to be used throughout the European Middle Ages, as well as various other types of torture, such as bleedings with leeches. In modern times, the equivalent of this practice is vaccinations with small dead doses of the virus to boost up the immune system against them, should they encounter them again. Another modern ingredient of this foul plot is tobacco, which, as it is packaged and sold to consumers in the medium of cigarettes, contains arsenic, tar, and other deadly toxins, all of which serve the same function as lead, to kill off the intestinal bacteria that cause the body to decay after death. Traces of tobacco have even been found in the mummies of Egypt, indicating their ancient knowledge of its use in preserving the genetic integrity of the fleshy tissues after their life has ceased. The practice of mummification is much older than either the Therapeutai or the mummies of ancient Egypt, and is probably a perennial practice in preparation for the eventual end of the world. The most recent mummies are, or were, Buddhist monks who drank lead-based liqueur and arsenic-laced spring water to stop their autotrophic life functions after surviving on nuts and tree bark for 6 years to thin and harden the tissues. Mummification is only one branch of the wellspring of spiritual legislation on the preparation for the moment of death and the unknown duration to follow. As I have said, much of humanity's metaphysic for the afterlife is founded on the soul or aura and astral body or spirit. The soul is attached to the body in the form of the aura, comprised of our accumulations of karma, which usually follow an identical pattern along a path of ascension. The spirit detaches from the corporeal vessel and rises into a clear light, as described by all mystics and those with near-death experiences. According to the doctrines of all the various mystery schools, it is important, almost necessary, to practice leaving the body in preparation for the moment of death, when the spirit will be severed from its customary control of the corporeal vessel. In the highest levels of gnosis, the presence of self-actualization is identified with Satan, or the concept of cognitive dissonance, in the universal mind. Strong believers in anthropomorphism might perceive the moment of death as a familiar personage, and, just as indicated in Greek theater, these psychodramas can play out over the entire course of someone's lifetime, leading up to their final moments. The reasoning for this is that the mind is in a highly diluted state relative to death. Blood bearing oxygen remains in the brain several minutes after fibrillation has stopped pumping blood through the heart, and this oxygen allows neural electric activity to continue for some time. Because people usually do not return from such a state, little observational data regarding it has been collected, and so it is unknown, for example, if the perceptions of the sensory mechanisms continue to function or not. In many people whose near-death experiences involved very sudden or shockingly transmundane experiences, they see their life flash before their eyes, becoming cognizant in microseconds of macro patterns underlying their lifeline that had eluded them their whole life long. It is possible that such a surge of neural kinetics and the continued hum of the brain as it feeds off the last of its air produce equivalent internal experiences, and these types of personal transcendent events are associated by modern psychologists with visions of a final judgment. The moral of all historical judgment visions is to know yourself while you are alive. This is not contingent on being understood by others, and the road less traveled is always the only one that does not lead to Rome. Once one has begun to learn about the physical part of the self, one will come to learn that it functions on an electrical charge that flows through all the flesh, controls the heart, and runs the brain. It is fact, if one wishes to learn it, that the neural kinetic reactions in our brain are synchronous with our thoughts, such that they are thought to be mutually causal, and that different frequency brain waves are produced in different states of waking consciousness, unconscious sleep, and dreaming. The entire physical corpuscle contains this flow, called Qi by the Chinese, who taught with martial arts how to channel and harness it for physical health, strength, and endurance. The duality of chemical, soma, induced neural electrical activity as external motivator, and naturally occurring inspiration as internal cause of thoughts predates the beginning of recorded history, where we find the roles of chief or elder hunter and shaman or medicine gatherer established possibly as the original hominid division of labor between the sexes. However, it is an issue that continues to this day, involving scholars of all fields. While the right and wrong of it are debated, by their compromises, it gradually becomes a medical reality, as all of our inherent physical systems are augmented by advances in scientific biotechnology, and we are introduced to the rules of the state. Drugs are about as equivalent to the soul as the state is to the realm of the spirit, but all schools that have derived wisdom from them teach us that there is much more karma in life than there is in any one style of it. The earliest professional philosophers were the Greek elementalists or pre-Socratics. They were the first to begin to describe the ether as more or less alike certain forms of natural phenomenon, namely the four elements. They were, in doing this, opening up the watchtowers to what would become an established spiritual realm in institutionalized religion, though at the time they were seeking to describe the essence of nature. Plato followed this with his strict segregation of the ideal realm, where the forms of or phylum were found, and the real realm, where the phenomena were observed. Little progress has been made in humanity's subsequent effort to tear down this wall from the side of the real, even up to modern-day existentialists who believe that existence, or base matter, subject, preceded essence, or the potential for spiritual ideal, object. The diamond key to cutting through the glass ceiling of the golden division is the Pythagorean extrapolation of the vesicle, or heart, and the cross, or helix, proportions, representing the realm of the ideal, from the pentagram, representing the realm of the real. There remains much to be said about this relationship. However, the aura is the energy of the pentagram, just as the potential for the release of kinetic energy is represented by the 5 digits of our hand. As I have already described, the ajna is the mind's eye. It represents the vista of mentation occurring in the mind, just as brain waves represent the neural electric activity occurring in the brain at the same time. Enlightenment, the goal of all seers, is a brainwave flatline while still alive and consciously awake. Since alpha waves, those produced during the dream state, are the slowest frequency and longest wavelength, such a state is pursued by attempting states of lucid dreaming and states of conscious dreaming, usually achieved through prolonged sleep deprivation. It is thought that, in this state of total mental detachment, the concept of time becomes meaningless, and this is the ultimate achievement of all mystery schools forever. The state of pure illumination is also associated with levitation. It is unknown why this would occur, even by many of the monks who attain it. However, one theory is that when their brainwaves stop creating a pulse-regulated field around the body, its electromagnetic signature begins to become distorted by the ambient background radiation of the environment, and its quantum frequencies are no longer in temporal synchronization with the electromagnetic imprint of the situation. A similar technology used in aircraft anti-gravity propulsion systems is the null wave, or zero-point projecting, triple scalar wave generators of flying saucers, and the Northrop TR-3A Black Manta. The null wave field, or zero point, without established temporal synchronous context, is the result of crossing scalar waves, which are themselves overlapping fields of wavelengths from multiple sources. In this way, the flatline history is derived from a scattered field, just as pure enlightenment may be achieved after waking dreams. In the same way that the loss of the controlling rhythm of the personal electromagnetic field causes it to fall into dystrophy, and this may stimulate a physical phenomenon as the field becomes distorted to its polarized environment, so does this produce for the field itself the effect of generating a light body sensation or feeling of free fall. This is the astral body, that naturally occurring electromagnetic signature of the soul, as it begins to detune itself from reality and fall out of phase with the comprehensible dimensions. The ambient shape of the aura surrounding the chakra path of the 33 spinal vertebrae is that of a torus, or hypersphere at antipode. When the pathway of Kundalini is aligned and the chi energy arises unimpeded, the aura involutes. Although it is represented by a light ionization of electrons, most of the aura is given off in the form of heat, or pure thermal radiation, the essence of which is tachyons. When the brain stops sending brain waves to control the regulation of the body's biorhythms, the aura begins to involute at the velocity of these underlying tachyons, becoming a potential energy dynamo, creating a temporal singularity. When this happens, consciousness flows through the mind in free association, without singular origin, being omnidirectional and without end, being unimpeded by the interjection of the ego. Here one perceives everything as nothingness. This is the ascension of the soul to the astral, spiritual, or ideal realm. From this point, one identifies the self with a conscious singularity in the realm of potential that can manifest itself where and whenever it chooses. The soul, when elevated before the Most High, becomes the spirit. The aura becomes the astral body. It is not the vessel that is changing. It is only its environment that is different. It is thought that the gross body is in accord with this same harmonic. The form of flesh, the electromagnetic aura, and the geometrical spirit are all one. When the electromagnetic aura is active, there is a physical reaction. When the aura leaves the host and travels throughout the universe and beyond the multiverse, it must adapt in its own way. Thus, we see that the vessel corresponds to its environment, whether this is physical, psychological, or heavenly. We must assume that it is therefore equally able to manipulate outcomes in the astral and karmic worlds as it is in the physical. As I have already described, the spirit is thought to be most at home in the idea of heaven as a community of other spirits, and this is why the realms of the unknown afterlife and the drug-induced spirit realm have been so judiciously legislated as similar, when in truth, since little serious research has been done on either openly and in a rigorous scientific manner, no such connection can rightly be inferred. The home of the angels in the heavens has been identified with various locations, both real and imaginary, ranging from the more realistic Hebrew Zohar on the 10 Sephirah, senses, and Buddhist 6 lokas archetypal realms in the cycle of reincarnation, to the less realistic Mormon interplanetary aliens, although I do like the Star Trek Interstellar and Star Wars Intergalactic ones. It is thought that the home of our ancestral dead is in the same location. In truth, it is clear that, if projected in the form of a potential, that is temporal, conscious singularity, a departed soul could go anywhere in the universe instantaneously by traveling through the wormhole multiverse surrounding gravitational singularities. It would even be convenient in these locations to leave the universe altogether, if one so willed it. By existing in the universe, in any form whatsoever, one is subject to the laws of physics. When one travels through higher dimensions, to move from one place in the material universe to another, through potential, one is subject to the laws of geometry. This is because geometry underlies the laws of physics in the universe, and higher dimensions tend to break down material forms into less manifest, more ideal systems according to the framework of this underlying geometry. In hyperdimension, in the light of geometry, spirit is like a pattern through and across the dimensions. Finally, in the presence of the primary clear light, all that is left of spirit is the pure geometry of this history without dimensional context. This is the highest extent of the existent gnosis, and it is why there is a G for geometry between the Masonic square and compass, both of which are, themselves, instruments for making geometrical measurements. The spirit can be free even of geometry, however. While it is in the presence of the divine, geometry is how spirit will know the divine. When the spirit frees itself of the trappings of geometry, there is no longer any difference between it and the essence of the deity, and they become, in essence, one and the same. However, if the spirit wishes to know itself as apart from the divine, geometry becomes key. In other words, pure geometry and pure spirit are one and the same in pure dimension, and pure spirit and the presence of deity are also the same in essence. As geometry underlies the laws of physics, and these are thought to be universal, and because pure geometry can be accessed through hyperspace by a projection of consciousness, there is literally nowhere that a spirit cannot go, and nothing that a spirit cannot do. It has utter free will, as it alone in the universe is capable of doing anything simply by instantaneous manifestation. However, we are told exactly the opposite is true. Just as ghosts are bound to a hoary netherworld of karmic limbo, angels are segregated to the clouds of heaven, and demons to the cavernous fires of hell. In heaven, the angels obey God, and God acts on behalf of man, bending his utter freedom to the bow of the covenant. In hell, there is a similar hierarchy, demons answering to Satan, and Satan the slave dog of God. Finally, the same scriptural style sources proclaim that humans alone are free. This last seems to be the missing capstone, since until very recently, wageless slavery was common throughout the world, and many of the same legislators who fought to abolish it owned slaves themselves. Now there is only extreme economic imbalance between the less than 1% of the world's population who control over 70% of the world's wealth, and the child labor sweatshops, environmentally polluting factories, and starving, diseased tribespeople they are responsible for. Still, if this is meant to represent a hologram of the mind of the archetypal human, it falls far short of the original lawmakers' specified standards. Too much importance has been placed on the brain in the legislation of spiritual matters. When it dies, apparently the free will given to man by God is thrown out the window, just as in the story of Adam and Eve being banished into labor. In the West, it is believed that no spirit that has lived in a body has free will without one, and in the East it is believed that to be free of the spirit is to be one with the divine. Thus it means that to give up the spirit is to give up free will, and thus to join with the divine. There is ample evidence of spirits that have given up their free will. This can occur for a person in their life, and then, when they die, their spirit will have no free will. According to Eastern tradition, this is the pattern of karma that results in reincarnation, or the same spirit being born again into a different body. However, in the West, Judeo-Christians sacrifice free will in this life for a better afterlife, building up karma for their future. This is commonly called the work ethic, and is seen pushed to its furthest limit by Muslim extremist suicide bombers. Thus it seems that it is possible for the spirit to regain free will after death, without necessarily reincarnating. It should only be important that the brain, as an organ, contains as much potential as the spirit, as an essence, can imbue, and that the spirit, connected to the divine by geometry, is infinite in potential. Just as the form of each living being has a signature electromagnetic aura, so the Earth and all the celestial bodies also have electromagnetic fields, and these are all arranged to one another in a webwork that generates gravitational spin in the universe by microwave electromagnetic fields. The universe itself emits an illumination of tachyon astral light. All these things obey the definition of a soul in the sense described by all mystics of all lands throughout time. It is easy enough at this point to see that all these souls are only one soul over time. This should not be taken entirely in the hierarchical sense as alike offices held by bureaucrats. These spatial levels can be seen as more like parts of a whole, like organs in an organism, in the same way that the strong nuclear force, fusion, and the weak nuclear force, fission, and the gravitational force, microwave tachyons, are all peripheral radiations within the electromagnetic spectrum. Geometry underlies all the laws of physics. The study of classical physics began with the study of shapes and measurements in ancient Greece. At every step in the scientific progress of classical physics, it has been supported by its geometry, from ancient public works to Newton's astrophysical theory of gravity. The study of modern quantum mechanics or particle physics is derived from the study of classical physics. The concepts of vector and spin, wavelength, and frequency, while expressed as algebraic variables in the axiomatic equations, are advanced derivations of geometry. So, just as there may be many levels to the soul, there is only one spirit, math. Black holes are the nuclei of galactic cells, and the singularities are its DNA. Just as mitochondrial DNA exists outside the nucleus of a cell, singularities can exist outside of black holes. Here we find the physical equivalent to the temporal patterns governing the evolution of the universe. Singularities cause geometric distortions to the laws of physics. Temporal, or naked singularities, are probability wells causing temporal distortions to fields of potential energy. Gravitational singularities, inside black holes, are potential fields causing gravitational distortion to wells of probability. The result of both is wormholes. In the case of naked singularities, these wormholes lead to other naked singularities in the universe. In the case of black holes, all the wormholes lead into the singularity through the fabric of space-time and outside the local universe, into a baby universe. The sum of all the parent universes and baby universes is called the multiverse, and comprised of infinite dimensions accessed inside the wormhole. In the same way that the laws of physics governing the matter passing through the black hole into the baby universe are slightly distorted by being passed through the wormholes to the gravitational singularity, so are the physical laws also distorted for the matter passing through a naked singularity wormhole. In both cases, the distortion is geometric, and therefore can be predicted. Long ago, an unknown personage of ancient origin, according to the histories out of southern Persia, came into the Greek and Nile areas and began writing divine instructions for understanding the cosmos. These rules were filtered down throughout most of the rest of Western culture, and we are told that a similar school began in the Far East, oriented around the concepts of light and dark. Although the name of this person has been forgotten by the ages, his association with certain local concepts of deity, such as the baboon or ibis in Egypt and the messenger in Greece, has preserved the tradition he long ago began. The most famous of his dictums was, "As above, so below." During the Roman era, this philosophy was present in the economic division of patrician and plebeian, while the Essenes and Nazarenes described themselves as children of light and darkness. However, during the European Dark Ages, this concept was rediscovered by alchemists, and the terms macrocosm, describing the cosmos, and microcosm, the unit, were derived. Only now we are finding similarities to the caduceus, or staff of the healer, and the double helix of genetic DNA, as the microcosm, and the Zen garden of forking paths, and the filaments, walls, and voids of the universe as the macrocosm. The pattern of phi over pi clearly emerges, where phi represents division and pi unification. Since division, as between filaments, nerves, genes during RNA replication, or quantum waves, and unification, as for individual celestial spheres, the gamete progenerative cells, DNA packing inside of the nucleus in ribosomes, or quantum particles, are obviously inverse of one another, like dark and light, It is cognitively dissonant for the unenlightened mind to perceive them as equivalent. Therefore, the idea accepted by the Greek philosophers, who began the first philosophical colleges in light of the wisdom of this ancient lawgiver, was that man must be separated from the cosmos, in the same way that an idea itself, such as the idea of self, is separate from the ideal realm of the mind. This makes sense because a light source, even one as prevalent as the sun, is only emitting rays into the darkness of the void, in the same way that ideas generate lines of reasoning that progress into unknown dreams. In this way, the macroverse became associated with the realm of ideal, where phi and pi are one geometry, and the microverse with the real, given, or material. Currently, scientists are seeking to discover a unified field theory, or grand unified theory, GUT, of everything. Until chaos theory became popular in capitalist culture from the mid-1970s to the early 1990s, these theories consisted of debates between machos and wimps, or strong and weak centers of gravity. The increased government funding of superconducting supercolliders and magnetic particle accelerators following the Mid-East oil embargo, however, allowed early computer program using, fractal generating mathematicians to exchange ideas with quantum physicists, and this is how string theory began. According to string theory, the universe is comprised of a finite number of vibrating frequencies, and these are hyperspace dimensions, coiled up very tightly, that cause all pattern in matter. Chaos theory, which is the attempt to make the mathematically abstract axiom of the uncertainty principle more elegant using fuzzy logic systems, and string theory both miss the mark of Einstein's own attempts at a unified field theory involving gravity. However, Einstein was quick to admit that his own theories, too, were imperfect and remained unconvinced of a gravitational constant as unifying ether. Combined, these theories would spin off into the even more modern theories of the holographic universe, based on the Hindu Maya, an energy illusion, and quantum consciousness, attempting to account for ESP. Another modern theory, called M-theory, doubles the dimensionality of the string frequency fabric of space-time, making the chaos fractal vibrations into waves of potential, passing effect through probabilities, and calling them dimensional brains. Each one of these theories is satisfactory in its data, however each is incomplete. The longer scientists wait to reveal to themselves what some ancients already knew long ago, the more these GUTs will pile up, until eventually we will need a gut of guts. It is within the reach of every one of us to know that everything is one, and this generates wide belief in one God. But the mechanisms necessary in order to convince others of the ways in which different things are similar elude the grasp of most, tainted as this all is by the superstition of good routine and evil change. The 6 fundamental questions of rhetorical reasoning lead us inevitably to a description of the universe as a dimensionally resonant, holomnemonic metaform, an effect being the inverse reaction to a cause on each swing of the temporally motivated pendulum of quantum uncertainty. It is as easy to anthropomorphize as it is to sympathize or empathize symbolically. The most common token exchange unit used for information transfer in this market is social statistics, thought to be an idealized, purely mathematical reflection for aggregate psychology. This implies that buying power accurately amounts for all quantifiable self-expression in a society, such that what is available in terms of goods and services meets all of the consumer's needs, amenities, and luxuries to satisfaction. This is the modus of totalitarian supply-side economics. However, its philosophical apology is a rhetorical Trojan horse, revealing demand-side economics as doomed to dependence on over-analysis of market research on target audiences, in effect already responsible for the social subclass of producers and executives in the strata of the capitalist cultural entertainment industry. We feel the effect of this struggle every time we shell out money for a bad movie. Because both supply-side and demand-side economics resort to the use of social statistics to understand the will of the masses, it could be imagined that the use of social statistics pre-existed economics. However, this is not accurate. Agrarian barter, or trade, economics flourished very well the world over using only folklore as culture, and it was not until the 19th century that the first industrial-based economies began opening up global commerce with the standardized token exchange system created long before in Old Sumer, and thus began again compiling detailed data on social statistics as had been done in the great civilizations since the invention of money. Social statistics are no older than the covenant called society, but statistics themselves are much older and underlie all probabilities that exist in potential. Statistics are the math upon which is based all cause and effect, that is, all physical behaviors of the human, guided through fate by free will, as well as the gross or base subjectivity of existence. It is always a factor of whether it is more or less likely that an event happens that causes an event to happen or not, and at this scale, the whole makeup of the universe is as relatively binary as the code in a computer program. It is thought to be at this level that quantum consciousness, that which interacts with the substance of the cosmos to co-create interactive reality, occurs. If Freud's theory of hypercathexis is accurate, then ego is something that accumulates electromagnetically in the nervous system. If the theory of a holographic continuum, unifying man, society, and the laws of physics, is accurate, then social consciousness, awareness, or civic spirit can be thought to build up to a point of hypercathexis in a similar way. It is easy for the eye to see this as possible in the filaments, walls, and voids of galaxies in the universe, because they resemble the human nervous system. However, this may prove to be an illusory similarity as to the amassing of sufficient probabilities to perform electromagnetic hypercathexis on a universal scale. By this same reasoning, the social structures of man, which do not physically resemble nerves but mimic them on the ideal level in the order of ranks and the branches of their hierarchies, might be capable of spiritual hypercathexis. These are all the hopes of many. that there may be scientific proof for God as the ego of the universe, and that this may bring true justice to our society and equality to our world. However, it is a house of cards comprised of axioms and dependent premises. The truth is that the winds of death long ago began to blow through the universe. If the galaxies furthest away are comprised of stars as mortal as ours, they burned out long ago, and so hypercathexis, even on a social scale, only takes one person. The truth is that ego is not the goal. The accumulation of pseudo-self-definitive belongings is counterproductive to the ultimate sacrifice of leaving the dying universe. However, it affects self-replication. It engenders doppelgangers, who in turn duplicate themselves with each other. This is looking at the spiral from an angle that accents the phi element. This is looking at the hypercube of time from above one of its corners, and seeing it as a tesseract. This is the universe on its ear. According to scholastic consciousness researchers of the 20th century, the mind that is trapped in samsara, the cycle of the soul reincarnating through manvantara, often turns to the playing out of roles relative to social situations. We see that this is true throughout all the more sentient animal species, and, insofar as pollination is a mating ritual, may account for the entire variety of appearance in plants. The study of how these social roles are transferred from one generation to another is currently called, by these same scholars, game theory, because in the higher mammals, it is through game playing in the young that their place in the pack is established. This returns us to the concept of the social sciences, which in no way differ from an ordering of anarchy. Here we see that the finer relationships, such as that between when and where, that between how and what, and that between who and why, elude the gross populace. In the place of these fine facts are fostered to fester, rancorous and odious, repetitious rituals of all sorts to engender our imposed roles. This is done because speculative philosophy is not considered as necessary as craft guildmanship for survival. This is probably due to an old pre-Egyptian custom of human cannibalism. Social class researches have also studied the difference between these in terms of infinite and finite games. As the saying goes, when I was a child, I behaved as a child, and when I became a man, I put away childish things. So it is with the finite games of guildcraft and the infinite games of speculative philosophy. Of the finite type of game, the point system is paramount. This serves only one function for the brain: to teach it math. Doing math is, for the brain, much like exercise is for the body. However, in conveying the ideal key of mathematics to the gross gray matter of the brain, society includes the hidden compounding interest fee of morality, and, in the West, greatly promotes the Epicurean idea that more is good and less is bad. Originally, the barter economy was based on conservation of resources. However, with the introduction of the token exchange system, the value placed on material goods has successfully been driven down, as the token of exchange is made increasingly ideal, that is, less and less substantial. The concept of technological capitalism, as representative of the withering dictatorship by the proletariat, has already taken the dollar off the gold standard and floated international credit. We get paid placebo points for work to placate us with playthings we must identify with. This type of game is a lifelong game and an everyday, common game, and nowadays considered necessary for survival. Another like this is the buddy system. Just as the ownership of private property became the twisted means by which to teach the karmic point system, so is the idea of collective property derived from naturally occurring friendship. As we grow, we will find ourselves near others that are in some ways like ourselves, and if we are attached enough to that part of us that is similar, we will be pulled towards these people. In the same way, we will gradually grow apart, the similarities we had changing in different ways until only different things are similar, and we will have already begun to turn away from the other. Our best friend is usually a person with whom we choose to share very personal information. And this is often because we see them as like a part of ourselves that we like. Buddies, chums, and pals are a lot of the worst sort, since they will always be aware of the karmic score in a way that a best friend would ignore. Best friends go on to make excellent spouses, should they fall in love and get married, because they will see reproduction as an extension of their combined self, just as a carpenter sees the hammer as an extension of the hand. Both the point system and the buddy system are games. They create the sort of existence known as virtual reality, tunnel reality, or game reality, where an organism contributes as little of their inner psyche as possible, except in exchange for the necessities of survival. When observing this archetypally, that is, manifest in someone, the common sufferer and contributor of this syndrome may feel repulsed. However, this is only because they are not seeing their own face when they look in the mirror. Only a person who is either more or less like what their parents, their loved ones, and themselves had hoped for and expected. On the other hand, the end game is a system. This is an infinite game because it is a zero-sum game and depends on the absence of all resources for conclusion. The end game is the knowledge to end all games. Cultural self-referentiality is artificial intelligence. Perhaps because of the aluminum byproduct-lined water, people go about their daily lives as though they were already cyborgs, part organic and part machine. That which they have cultivated within themselves as civility is like an intangible tax on their immunity, and, like dinosaurs, the toiling masses wither beneath their share of days. Rather than our actually being anything like dinosaurs, it is only our dependence on the fossil fuels produced by the resin of ancient plants and the fats of the dinosaurs' skins that has brought us so low, as well as that has elevated us to such heights. In the same way that many biblical scholars associate the realm of tempest and flood with the chaos and luxury of politics, so can this ghost of a great beast, the thunder lizard, be ideally seen as equivalent to the demiurge of the Leviathan. Hobbes described the Leviathan as the political hierarchy ruled by the monarchy. Considering that the dinosaurs died, The idea that there's spirit ruling over us in the form of our nascent capacity for social administration is, in some way, potentially threatening, is altogether understandable. However, they merely represent an earlier form of life, also evolved by the interaction of bacteria and viruses. So we see that our system of checks and balances is inherently the same, though guided by free will. To this end, it becomes increasingly easy to find examples of how the reptilian mental characteristics, or the blue bloods, have always turned survival into their gain. From the story of the dinosaur snake tempting mitochondrial Eve into the trees to evolve thumbs for the apple of civilization, and banishing monkey Adam to evolve feet wandering the grasslands of the tropical savanna, through Quetzalcoatl as Tili, to the promised return of the King of the Jews to rule the whole of the godly people. Another, more spiritual than geometric, symbol of Freemasonry is the coffin. Its importance in ritual is similar to the womb, but its significance socially is best evinced in the Russian fable, "How much land does a man need?" This is the area that a large part of our unconscious energy is being driven towards, that directly surrounding the corporeal body, and all life has evolved this way for survival. Because a similar thought bubble surrounds various other forms, it is tempting to discard one appeal for another. However, this does not follow, and one will not find satisfaction unless they part with the ways of all the vessels. Just as the coffin is the box for the body, the hypercube of time is the cubed exponent of the universe. Imagine the universe as an expanding sphere, with the continuum of space-time as its surface. Inside this sphere is infinite potential dimension. Outside of it are tachyons traveling from the future to the past. This is the hypersphere of the multiverse. Now imagine a unit of time, an event, as a cube. Another cube can, in the same way, be drawn around the entire universe, and this represents time. Just as the universe becomes the multiverse, sphere expanding into hypersphere, through the force of time, so does each individual unit of information in the universe shift about and change with time. Time changes as the temporal hypercube slowly turns around in the fourth spatial dimension, causing spatial involution on the surface of space-time, and slowly bringing the third dimensional representation, or shadow, of the fourth spatial dimensional object, of the temporal force, through a cycle from cube to antipode, to nested hypercube, to tesseract, to antipode, to cube. These are only the names of the points for alignment, and there are many other lattices that represent potential viewpoints on the shape that go unnamed. The reason that the hypercube of 4 time is the cube exponent of 3 space is the same reason that the hypersphere is phi over pi, just as phi over pi can be represented as an oscillating spiral. So can the cube exponent be represented by a hexagram within a square, representing a cube within a cube. If they were only arrayed upon the spiral, the 10 emanations would have no apparent order, but because the pattern of the alternating hexagram and square form a smaller fractal hypercube at antipode, they take on the familiar pattern of the Kabbalah. The emanations, or corners, on the actual cube exponent fractal pattern inside the hypercube of time are best understood as cyclical events, or a series of similar settings and situations that recurs repeatedly. Another example of a temporal measurement that, to derive the cube of the sphere, stems from the Orient and is a set of 64 different event outcomes arranged in a predictive oracular system known as the I Ching. Both the Kabbalah and the I Ching are temporal systems and represent the flow of the unified field or time through the universe. The I Ching has been decoded as a lunar calendar ending in the year 2012. A Bactun in the ancient Mayan calendar also ends in 2012. The Mayan calendar was based on observations of the solar system's ecliptic orbital plane relative to the center of the galaxy, which they apparently derived from the retrograde cycles of Venus and of sunspot cycles that rival those made with the scientific advances of modern technology. Samsara, or the 6 lokas of reincarnating realms, derive from the 8 doubles representing the regular variation of the temporal fluctuation of the I Ching. Phi over pi and the hypercube at antipode are both living patterns, the former the growth signature of bacterial DNA, the latter the shape of the ribosomal virus. Therefore, they are alive relative to one another. The fact that these forms, which are the geometry underlying the laws of physics, comprise the two intertwining histories of a living double helix relative to one another proves that electromagnetic entities, such as archetypal spirits, are as much alive as you or I. If free will is a right only of the living, then free will to all. In this way, the body of God is a living organism of dissonant and resonant tonalities. Just because you are only learning this now does not mean that it has not always been so. Angels are only points of reference, bent toward us by the karmic signature of our aura, carried over from all of our past lives. First, we must agree on the direction of the flow of time. This can be in any combination of the 3 recognized essential components, past, present, and future, so that time flows from one to the next, and from one to the last, or from both to the next and to the last, or to neither at all. What our senses compel us to recognize is the particular arrangement of these components we have come to call the forward-flowing arrow of time. This is basically a measure of matter-energy exchange dictating that, as things continue, they decongeal. The best evidence created by the hand of man for common interaction with this all-powerful force is the clock, a sequence of numbers arranged in a circle around a set of 3 hands that move from one point on the circle to another at regular rates. The most powerful type of clock is the atomic clock, the rhythm of which is regulated by radioactive decay internal to the mechanism. This makes it accurate at varying altitudes, where one must travel greater distances in a shorter amount of time to keep up with the fixed spot on the globe below. It renders time, then, relative to the speed of light, since the particles ejected by the unstable element will appear as a Doppler-shifted wavelength. The distortion will occur between the atomic clock and the position of an observer either before or behind it on its path above the planet, and this is a very nice little model for time. Now imagine that you wish to count numbers. Say, perhaps you have grown tired of the atomic clock counting all the numbers. Nor is there any reason for you to count the numbers just like an atomic clock would. Since you are not an atomic clock, you are a quite sane and rational human being, so you decide to count the numbers as fast as you can. You will quickly see that you can count faster than the seconds on the atomic clock. Now imagine that you can count asymptotically fast. Of course, we know that this is impossible, but pause for a moment to consider why we think it's so. I propose that the location of this particular idea is between the full set of ideas developed by and for our evolution, and the abyss of what is not known even in idea. Thus, it is possible, although it has never presented itself as an option in such a way as to impinge upon our survival selectivity and become a more common probability. On the other hand, for example, if we happened to build spacecrafts that were piloted by just such a method of counting, then it could be argued that, at least after several generations, we would begin to spontaneously mutate towards a mode of thinking more compatible with that method of comprehension, and would then be as comfortable with it as we are now with our atomic clock. So begin in this manner, then. Watch the seconds tick past on the atomic clock and start to count asymptotically fast. At some point you will find that you are continuing to count, and the seconds on the atomic clock have wound down and stopped. Well, what has happened here? It would be reasonable to hypothesize that you had gone off onto an alternate timeline, leaving the timeline counted off by the atomic clock behind, if you can still call what you are in a timeline. You would have to say that it was an offshoot of the other timeline, similar to the measure of depth transecting the measure of length, with one exception. Since your timeline is counted off in an asymptote, it only lasts one moment of atomic time, but since the asymptote can never reach an end, neither does that moment ever end. What we are perceiving now is time flowing in a different direction. Both timelines count the same ultimate measure. It will be infinity on the clock before time runs out. The clock stops. Your counting speeds up. Therefore, they may just swap over from one direction to the next and continue on without more than a momentary break. This, it seems, is similar to the geometric distortions to gravity around massive or phenomenally dense objects. If space-time encounters an impediment to its forward-flowing momentum, it simply adjusts the angles of its coordinate system around it. Of course, what we are observing in the case of gravity is only the refraction of photons due to their impact with the force fields of gravity that surround all physical objects prone to entropy, and it is, in that context, convenient to see relativity between the curvature to photon trajectories and the emanation of virtual particles by real particles as they contact other real particles or other virtual particles. What, however, does this mean in our asymptotic counting experiment? The idea of an alternate timeline having been introduced as a potentially common occurrence In the twisting and turning of the time stream, we see immediately the ultimate implication such a concession to gravity lets in: the existence of infinite potential timelines, each leading to a different future, all occurring simultaneously within the moment. And while this seems an accurate depiction of an event from the perspective of potential, we also know that probability intercedes to manifest possibilities which delimit the event and put it into a context which we then call time. Without possibilities, such as the atomic clock, we would not understand time in the linear way that we do. The asymptotic counting experiment has allowed us also to conceive of time as being infinite in potential. I ought to further stress the fact that one need not necessarily count asymptotically to accomplish the effects we are discussing here. One could recite a chant, even hum. In fact, when you see that your mind itself is only a conduit whereby for the thought of an asymptote to come into existence, and that it is an idea that can exist independently of your mind as part of nature, then you can remove your focus to one side, if you like, and let this asymptote float in the center of event at the very core of time. It is, after all, always there in potential. Conveniently, it is the mathematical expression for the infinite potential that constitutes time. However, the asymptote itself and its potential effect on time must still be seen as separate concepts. Time doesn't stop every time you imagine an asymptote. So what trait of this asymptote makes it possible for time to potentially wind down and stop? We see evidence for the asymptote's physical existence in the gravity of black holes, and the symmetry breaking of certain particles when accelerated towards the speed of light. But we know that the asymptote is somehow removed from and above these artifacts, just as we know that time would continue to exist even if we didn't have the atomic clock to measure it. The real question then is time potentially an exclusively mathematical function, like the asymptote, that can be removed from material reality into the same realm as the asymptote? Is there time in the domain of mental projective space in which you created your trans-temporal asymptote? Is time nothing more than the relativity of sets of numbers? If we say that time is something other than death, then we can answer that it might then be nothing more than the relativity of sets of numbers. The atomic clock, then, is the dependent object, rather than its subject. We understand time as the linear unfurling of a circular cycle. This same observation applies to the orbits of the planets in the heavens. They, too, are only a representation of the idea of change underlying their perpetual rearrangements. And if time is described best only by the relativities of these sets of finite objects, parts, or merely numbers, then we can say that it does exist in the realm of the mental conceptual, and even in such a way that it will allow itself to be imagined as a geometric extrapolation of potential, like the asymptote, and sustained that way as a visualizable thought. Now, aside from our understanding of time as the linear relativity between circular cycles, and our knowledge of the asymptote as a geometric function, we cannot say whether these two do or do not exist in the same form, except in potential. We only believe what we do about time because of applying certain tools to it and not others. As we have seen, you can easily imagine counting faster than the clock, and I can easily imagine you doing this infinitely faster, and from these combinations we can see time as potential. In the future, other people will look at time differently, and see it to be like different things. In fact, I think our old friends the ancients may have had something to say about this very thing. It was their observation in the Orient that heart rate often joined with time in a mysterious way, such that when the heart rate was slow, events would seem to move slowly, and when the heart rate was fast, events would seem to move rapidly. The yogic mystics and the Brahmins attained to states of mastery over their emotions, because it was thought that by binding the movement of the subtle energies within, one could influence their ebb and flow without. There was a similar belief regarding the eyes that originated in Egypt. It concerned the mythical third eye, the urius, located in the center of the forehead, identical to the Vedic ajna, from which it was thought the substance of the human essence flowed down into us from the realm of the mysteries. The best explanation regarding the third eye comes to us from Jose Silva's modern method of mind control, which informs us that a 20-degree angle of inclination for the closed eyes produces alpha waves in the brain, those found in the minds of all meditators the world over. This has been used more frequently for the purposes of manifestation. A further note was made that certain nervous involutions contribute directly to the elapse of time. The ancients of the Orient again sought mastery over these breaks from ideal concentration, believing that the nervous system was the instrument triggering certain possibilities. Particularly the practitioners of the martial arts and the dervishes, as well as the American colonial Shakers, all partook of this fountain of energy. The biological circuit these comprise is mathematically a phi over pi spiral, the same essential pattern as a flower. The fundamental idea of the phi over pi spiral is symmetry breaking governed by irrational numbers, wherein the irrational numbers are like phi and pi, and the symmetry breaking is often in an asymptotical form, from an asymptote or between two asymptotes. Let us look for a moment at this last example. In our counting experiment, we felt relatively safe assuming that the timeline of the clock was linear insofar as it described a sequential progression without retrogression. But were we wrong in doing so? It can equally as easily be imagined as an asymptote itself, if one dwells upon the potential that the instants, as soon as they are measured, disappear. To where do they disappear? When something changes, where does what it once was go? And from where do the instants come before they are measured? Both the past and the future are like asymptotes stretching outward and upwards into infinity, disappearing in the same direction as the asymptote of time measured by your counting. The asymptotes of past and future meet, then, at the point where the clock has been stopped by the asymptotical counting experiment. I think this is a satisfactory definition of the now, the event that can begin but never end. In this capacity, we can imagine it as a phi over pi spiral, where phi is the future, pi the past, and their ratio the singularity of the present moment. Let me remind you that this is the same as the distortion we saw at the beginning that affects the observation of photons emitted by the radioactive decay of an unstable element in motion, depending on whether it is perceived as from before or behind it on its course. If we observe this phenomenon from the side, seeing both the Doppler distortions which constitute the future and the past for the trajectory of the element, we will again behold the phi over pi spiral, where pi determines a compressed wavelength before it, and phi determines an elongated wavelength behind it. This is known commonly as the red and blue shifts to the frequency of light, and this is how it would be observed in the case of the atomic clock. There is no comparable observation for the change in timelines represented by the asymptotic counting experiment, although we can now see it, at least if we like, as a representation of the same underlying mathematical pattern. In ancient Egypt, the body of Osiris was resurrected by the magic of Thoth, who was associated with the moon and represented time. In India, time is the Maya, illusion, of Manvantara, substance, begat by Brahma, sustained by Vishnu, and ending in Kali Yuga, the age of destruction. In Egypt, Osiris was betrayed and murdered by Set, later associated by the Hebrews with the serpent of Eden and with Shaitan, the adversary, as a god of Babylon during the captivity. In India, Manvantara is also associated with the serpent as the constellation Draco, the Tele of the Jews, and the Poimander of Hermes, the Greek equivalent of Thoth. This was a symbol of precession and of the cyclical nature of time, the Ouroboros, or snake biting its own tail. In modern mathematics, this concept is dually associated with self-symmetry, autocorrelation, and self-embedding or self-referentiality, autoreplication. One such shape that fits this description is the Mobius strip, or three-dimensional shadow of the four-dimensional torus, whose measure is phi over pi. The numerical equivalent of the Mobius strip is infinity, whose number symbol is a Mobius strip. We know that the given definition of infinity is as the last number that falls at the end of the number line. But according to the implications of its definition, infinity is boundless beyond measure, and so it is oft used to mean stretching off into pointless abstraction further than any finite limit, i.e., ad infinitum. In truth, like a Mobius strip, infinity acts holographically. Any set of numbers less than infinity can also act as a set with infinite measure, either by one-to-one correspondence with another set, or by producing an infinite set of components. The shortest set that can act as infinity by one-to-one correspondence is that including transcendental, transfinite, complex, and imaginary numbers. Each of these numbers has a sum whose decimals trail off into infinity, and, when taken all together, though they are not yet all known, they will pair off with any of the other infinite number sets as a statistical imperative. The natural numbers are all the positive whole numbers, and, beginning with 1, they form the definitive number line that stretches off to end on the other side with infinity. The counting numbers, which are the same as the natural numbers but include 0, would seem to always have one digit more than the natural number set. However, since it is impossible to reach the infinite end of either set, they match up in one-to-one correspondence, underscoring the lack of numerical value of 0. Similarly, the set of integers should be twice as long as that of natural numbers, since it includes its whole mere reflection in negative numbers, right out to negative infinity. However, since a list of all integers and a list of all natural numbers cannot be calculated, integers act holographically as an identical measure of infinity with the naturals. The only set of numbers that is not denumerable by one-to-one correspondence is the set containing all fractions and decimals. Because a number different from any number on an ongoing list of decimals between any two integers can always be calculated, since such a list itself would have to stretch to an infinity of fractions, each with an infinity of numbers after the decimal place, then no list of one-to-one correspondence can be compiled for all rational numbers. It is literally a set of an infinity of infinities, but it still is only equal to infinity. Since it exists beyond the realm of hard proof, it describes infinity better fits the traditional definition of a truism, something accepted as true despite lack of proof. Truisms generally take one of two forms, variable or constant, and are represented by a symbol as if they were their own function. A function sign, though, such as that for the square root, the multiplication or division signs, plus or minus, indicate an action of change to be performed. They are the verbs of math. Variables, by that line of reasoning, are the pronouns, and constants, the proper nouns. Variables, such as positive for positive numbers and negative for negative numbers, imply a passive state. Constants are set in stone. For example, even though they are irrational numbers that defy complete calculation, by giving pi and phi their own Greek letter names, it allows them to be used in the context of equations. Similarly, the speed of light in a vacuum, represented by c in physics, or Planck's first and second constants, are rarely seen in their raw mathematical form, but only identified by their symbols. So what role does infinity play in its symbolic form? It is not a function because it does not initiate change, nor can it be a constant, since it has no other more formal form. Therefore, it must be a variable, like x representing the unknown component in an equation. Infinity represents some unknown, very large sum. What can be said about x can also be said about infinity. X is a finite, unknown sum. Infinity, likewise, is just the last number at the end of a finite number line, even if it does possess holographic qualities to represent simultaneously the sum of that number line and thus a number at once larger than its own place value. The only other symbol that can act holographically as at once a number in sequence and the sum total at the end of that sequence is the empty set, or the set containing no numbers at all. But what does this say about the cyclical nature of time and the infinite body of God? What we are seeing by the number lines of comparative length that all holographically measure up to infinity is a series of vectors on the surface of the shape of the Mobius strip itself. If this is the case, however, then there must be spin to the shape and movement to infinity. How can this be? Just as the method for calculating a different decimal than any in the asymptotically long list of rational decimals between two integers is taking a different first decimal place number from that of the first decimal, a different second from the second, and so forth. The method of measuring spin is to create a matrix and measure it for diagonal symmetry. How can this be done for infinity without creating a number square, infinity by infinity matrix? Since infinity acts holographically, It should be possible using only a finite number set and the method of one-to-one correspondence. It should be noted at this time that an open set that is self-referential and self-symmetric is preferable because it will tend to generate an asymptotically open geometry for the Mobius strip shape of infinity, and in this way better imitate the geometry of the torus, or open sphere, of which the Mobius strip is a lesser dimensional shadow. So a set of 10 terms will work just as well as one of 7, 12, 22, or even only 3, because any number of numbers on an arc can be shown to occur within the infinite number line by tracing a perpendicular line between the two that stretches to a perspective point called n, or aleph sub 1, which I will discuss next, above and beyond both. In 777, Aleister Crowley has provided us with what he calls a magical alphabet of correspondences based on a simple number equivalency system. In fact, it is a magic number square of names and traits of the divine, and since it is an open system to which more can be added at any time, or parts subtracted without reducing the whole, it can serve as a matrix for measuring the vectors of the number lines for the holographic components of infinity. As an orthogonally reducible symmetric matrix, we can see that the spin of the Mobius strip is that of a real particle, but since it is orthogonal, it reduces to 0 dimensionally. Any integer number spin, 0, 1, 2, etc., represents a boson, so the Mobius strip is indeed a true, real shape, but with all the vectors reducing holographically to nothing. It means that whatever movement the Mobius strip makes is self-absorbed. This is in keeping with the self-referential, self-symmetric nature predicted, and also imputes the self-similarity between infinity and the null set. Now, how can we measure this orthogonality by Crowley's 777? It is said that all is one, and already this one is nothing. All the God names and traits amount to a description of a belief, an unproved truism, an unknown variable. This is inherent in the open set of adjectives, and reflected by the mythology of the death of Osiris in Egypt, Kali Yuga in India, and the banishment of Adam and Eve from Eden in Hebrew. This does not, however, mean that God does not exist. It neither proves nor disproves to this end. Like the spin of a Mobius strip, it simply hypothesizes that the effect of active and passive aspects of the divine cancel each other out. Just as the shape of the fourth temporal dimension might be known by that of the fourth spatial dimensional torus, Mobius strip, or tesseract, hypercube, that can be measured as shadows in the third dimension, as a sphere or cube, with spin that cancels itself out into a zero-dimensional matrix, so can it be hypothesized that traditional forms of the divine have been associated with these forms and phenomena. However, these forms and their traits can only describe higher physics, or the shape of the Godhead, while an equal amount of tradition has been ascribed to the personality of the divine persona. Also, in recent mathematics, numbers higher than infinity have been proposed with the same characteristic traits as the symbol of infinity. Two schools exist on these transinfinite numbers. The former is the Aleph school, the latter the N school. It can be proposed that, just as man is thought to have higher powers, so too does God have a spiritual side. This is traditionally associated with the ethereal Holy Spirit, or that aspect of God which is omnipresent, yet invisible, and, at least to the senses, intangible. This has long also been associated with the belief that God is discorporeal, and does not dwell within, for example, each and every one of our human forms. As regards the hierarchy of higher powers, from demons and angels in orders and choirs, to simply the soul and spirit, the Aleph system follows the letter designation with a subnumber, such as Aleph sub 1, Aleph sub 2, etc. It can also be said that, insofar as the anthropomorphic projection of the divine has a personality, such is psychological. In ancient Gnostic Apocrypha, the psyche of God was associated with the feminine essence of wisdom, called the Sophia. God has many personality traits, from the God of an eye for an eye, to the God of love thy neighbor as thou love thyself, through the Buddhist conception of a formless, tranquil aura, and the deist absentee watchmaker God. If the body of God is beneath that ideation representing time, that it may therefore be healed by such, as in the Egyptian myth, then it is right to place the ineffable mind of God beyond the infinite Mobius strip of a self-embedded temporal cycle, as in the Hindu cosmology. Insofar as both are further theoretical extrapolations on the concept of infinity, the N school, which is dimensional and pertains to physics, and the Aleph school, which is numerical and pertains to mathematics, are describing the same unknown and exclusively theoretical realm, albeit in different and unique ways. It is thought to be the vibrational fluctuations of probabilities in chain reactions of cause and effect from one event to the next in a continuum of infinite potential that cause the function of matter-energy exchange to occur in the forms that it does, that is, as the expansion of the universe, indicated by the homogeneous redshifting of galaxies, as the electrogravitational arrangements of galaxies in filaments, walls, and voids, as the underlying cause of the different forms of nebulae, galaxies, such as spiral galaxies like our own Milky Way, and clusters, the orbits of the planets around stars, and even as the behavior of quanta, such as the uncertainty principle. The best name for this theory is wave theory, but it would never catch on. This theory has been advanced as far as this stage publicly, but it has been advanced much further in private. It applies to brain waves and can be seen in the patterns of traffic in the street. We are all aware that every day the sun rises and sets, and we can be confident that it has done this in the same way for many billions of years, and, as scientists predict, will continue to do so for many billions more. The sun is a star, just like the billions and billions that we can see in the night sky after the sun has set. But the sun is close, and the other stars are very, very far away. The stars that we can see at night are arranged in nebulae, galaxies, and clusters, and our own star is part of a spiral galaxy called the Milky Way. The closest galaxy to our own is the Andromeda Galaxy, and both these galaxies are part of the nearest supercluster of galaxies, named Virgo for the constellation of the area in the night sky where it is visible. These superclusters are connected to one another by strands of smaller clusters and stray galaxies known as the filaments. A very thick strand of these superclusters runs around the entire universe from above Earth's orbital plane to the north to below it in the south, and this is called the Great Wall. Between these filaments there is empty space, and it is only based on the anthropic argument that we are led to believe the same laws of physics apply in these dead zones as in the rest of space. According to recent scientific studies, the universe's rate of expansion cannot be accounted for as being based on the amount of gravity resultant from the mass of known matter, or that which emits or reflects radiation. Therefore, something must be out in the voids to account for our apparently accelerating expansion. This has led astrophysicists to the erroneous postulate of dark matter and the study of black holes. Though black holes were postulated as a mathematical probability based on the accepted theory of space-time relativity, according to the exchange of matter and energy, they were not observed until they were discovered at the centers of spiral and other flat disk galaxies. Here we see the most ancient of the universe's quantum fluctuations, a spinning wave that acquired polarity and became a particle that passed through the phases of all the four elemental forces as it became a star, then through all the main sequence of different phases in a star's life, until finally it accumulated enough gravitational distortion to collapse in on itself and rip a hole in the fabric of space-time with so much gravitational pull that the stars in space all around it began to move towards it and around it, and nebulous gas clouds approached, and its gravity started starbirth within them, until finally an entire galaxy surrounded it in a vast accretion disk, flattened into orbit by its continuing polarity, and spewing gas jets out of its electromagnetic poles, comprised of tachyons, the only particles fast enough to escape its gravitational pull. These tachyons are the particle carriers of the actual gravitational force of the black hole, moving in the proper direction through time, as measured by entropy for a force-carrying particle. The tachyons involute as they pass through all the larger particles, and this pushes the particles back in the opposite direction the tachyons are traveling, hence creating the force of gravity. They are high-frequency, micro-wavelength electromagnetic radiation, and are only visible when they are passing through a solid body, such as the gas jets of the black hole. When they can be seen, they are observed to move faster than light, or photic radiation, thought to be the standard maximum velocity for radiation. Entropy, as a measure of time, is fixed to the speed of the photon, and so, when we say the tachyons emitted from a light source will arrive before the light, meaning that they will have already delivered their depiction of the carrier information pattern before we can see it, we are saying that tachyons are negentropic, or opposite the standard arrow of time. We also consider ourselves to be negentropic, as we struggle to survive against all odds. Just as when the orbital plane or pole of a star aligns with that of another, there is a slight electromagnetic effect, so when it aligns with a black hole, there is a greater effect. Similarly, when the galactic accretion disks of black holes align with one another, there is a very strong electromagnetic effect, and so when the gas jets of black holes align with one another, there is a tachyon effect. The singularities inside black holes probably represent the oldest quantum fluctuations in the universe, but they do not represent what will be the fate for most of their offspring reactions. The oldest black holes, and any black holes formed by stars they created, will eventually merge into supermassive black holes. By then, there will be no matter left in the universe, and not enough ambient radiation to feed these supergiants, who will eventually burn out, taking the last of the light in the universe with them, and leaving our entire multiverse of alternate universes in parallel potential dimensions leveled down to the constituent tachyons. This will not mean the universe has been destroyed. In accordance with the conservation of potential, matter can only be converted to energy, while energy cannot be destroyed. So will it be with our universe, that every last particle would be converted into a wave. The reason for this is simple. Virtual particles have fractional spin, while real particles have whole spin. It simply takes more than one wave to form a particle. Therefore, while wavelengths can arise from various random fluctuations in probability, a number of these must align in a combinatory way over time to create a mass particle. Our universe is already built on laws of physics whose structural framework is a geometry of vibrational dimensions. However, eventually these hollow mnemonic vibrations will be all that remains. The potential inversion of the uncertainty principle necessary to continuously manifest this will statistically disperse with the elements of the radiation, until eventually this geometry will be entirely unrealized. Of all the known structures in the universe, one of the most complex is the human nervous system. Consider the difference between the tissues of the nervous system and the trunk of a tree. While the tree has a homogeneous tissue that allows fluid transport, channeling water from the roots to the leaves, turning them green, and air down to the roots so they can breathe underground. Each nerve has a similar structure, with a myelin sheath made of high-acid sugar, similar to our genes, surrounding the nerve like the bark of the tree, and inside which an ionized fluid suspension allows the transport of an electrical charge from the dendrites, roots, to the axons, leaves, where it is translated into chemical neurotransmitters and crosses over to another dendrite. Axons also act as sense receptor nerve cells, electrically transmitting neural sense perception from the skin. In the gray matter of the brain, the neurons grow in functionally associative columns outward from the middle. All of the five senses travel through the nervous system, and in the electrical potential of the nervous system lies the capacity for extrasensory perception. When parts of the nervous system are shut down, the parts of the body or the perception of the senses these nerves control are also shut down, and, though still functional in potential, and as alive as any other part of the living body, they will be delivering no information to the rest of the brain and can carry no commands from it. It is the primary organ of the nervous system, the brain, that has become the primary organ of the human body, governing all our behaviors, a savior to our survival. The brain created society, and society is responsible for our exponential population growth. As our population grows, we imprint ourselves more and more on our environment, and this makes culture comparable to a virus. The nervous system itself, with its four lower branches and the genitals below the brain at the top, resembles very much the familiar hexagonal-headed shape of a bacteriophage virus. It is possible that, while the first, most basic bacterial microorganism was busy fighting off its natural predators, that is, viruses, the archetypal imprint pattern in DNA that would result in all the later organisms from trilobites on was conceived between them. In this way, at least, humanity is a hybrid species, and insofar as the virus may have originated off-world, we may even be a truly alien species in origin. Coincidentally, it is entirely bacterial microorganisms that are responsible for decomposition. One modern theory for information transfer that has arisen from social exchange theory is memetics, or the theory of information itself as virus-like in its transmission. This would mean that the entire struggle between active society and passive culture is merely the continuation of the war between the two genders of organism, viral and bacterial life forms. Aside from its being generally applied by populist Darwinian Malthusians who believe that society is a popularity contest governed by survival of the fittest, this seems to be a valid theory. According to this theory, information is transmitted in units called memes, although the same conclusion is reached by quantum mechanics and the information units called quanta. Memes become more or less popular or catch on in a direct proportion to how easy they are to remember. Perhaps the best example of this is early subliminal messages used in music, played in department stores, containing simple messages meant to be delivered directly into the subconscious, such as "Don't steal," "Mommy loves you," and "It's okay to do better than Daddy." By this reasoning, it is easy to understand why more people know Einstein's famous equation for relativity than the more obfuscated equation for the uncertainty principle. This leads to a general devaluation of information and has resulted in what has been recently identified by sociologists as a soundbite media, fast food culture, and hot button issues. In this media circus, everyone is famous for 15 minutes, which is never enough time to get anything done. A shortcut to saying that mankind is a plague on the environment is saying that intelligence is a disease to humanity. First, come to accept that half the universe is dead. We still see the light from distant stars even though they burned out long ago. Then understand that the universe is a gravitational field bent into an expanding well, the surface of which is comprised of matter-energy exchange and is measured by the speed of light. As the light moves inward on the surface of the spherical universe, gravity moves outward. Inside the third-dimensional surface of the gravity field is the illusion of light we perceive as our universe. Outside the universe, it glows faster than light tachyons. Inside the surface of the sphere are other dimensions, accessed in tachyons, coiled up very tightly and vibrating in superstrings, or microwave gravity, that cause the underlying harmonic resonance, or geometry, of the filaments of superclusters. The multiverse of infinite potential dimensions inside the expanding third-dimensional universe, as well as the matter-energy exchange of the material universe, caused by the fourth-dimensional force of time, and any baby universes formed through black holes, are the microverse, while the tachyons that shine from the surface of the universe into the greater black hole of the parent universe, that comprise the primary clear light of Yalem, the universal singularity, as well as the parent universe that has formed us as a singularity inside a black hole, are the macroverse. The microverse inside the macroverse is space-time. The macroverse around the microverse is time-space. It has been demonstrated that when two metal plates are held only microns apart from one another, so that no particle of any size should be able to fit between them, there is still a quantum foam, or geometrical kaleidoscope of empty bubbles separated by inversions, from the uncertainty principle causing probabilities to arise at random from potential. This quantum foam effect is stimulated by prismatic refraction of microwave-length probabilities in fields of potential that are thought to be caused by the vibrations of superstrings, or tightly coiled dimensions, and resembles the same randomized pattern of web work as the filaments of galaxies. If we say that tachyons, which produce gravity as microwaves opposite the flow of entropy, are the hitherto undiscovered gravitons, or force-carrying particles of the gravitational element, then they can be seen to serve as Einstein's elusive gravitational constant. And if gravity is an illusion of light moving faster than light that results in the effect we call time, then we are well on our way to a grand unified theory that unites the gravitational constant with the temporal dimension. Just as this original and most basic form of matter energy is brought forth through the quantum foam, that is, over time, so is it the substance of time, that is, probability. However, because tachyons move faster than light, they are antimatter, and therefore cannot be a probability in this universe, that is, this reality of light. Tachyons are an inverse probability because they move faster than photons. Photons themselves are a real particle, and therefore cannot carry the electromagnetic force of their own light. Instead, it is tachyons, as Cherenkov light, that emanate from the photon that give it the appearance of illumination. Therefore, we see that the speed of light is irrelevant, since the light from a photon precedes the photon. Thus, it would not be exactly accurate to call tachyons antimatter. They do not, for example, immediately explode on collision with their counterparticle of matter, because they do not have a counterpart particle. On the other hand, if we could see these particles, it would prove they don't exist as just clear ideal. We know that there are tachyons outside the universe because the universe is bound by the speed of light, and tachyons move faster than light. Therefore, we associate them with the holographic hypercube of time. Their frequency vibrations, known as superstrings, are equivalent to the pure geometry that exists in the realm of the ideal. This means the cube exponent of the turning hypercube and the phi over pi spiral expanding hypersphere interact with one another in the continuum of tachyons. Fermions and bosons are molecules of dimensions. Their spin potential variability is determined by trans-dimensional interaction. The dimensions themselves remain outside of and beyond the forms they generate, as the nuclei of two covalently bonded atoms. They are as the philosophical definition of the ideal. Before we can consider the specific cases of fermions and bosons, we must delve a little deeper into the nature of the dimensions. It cannot be argued that the first dimension is a singularity, the ultimate embodiment of symmetry. The second dimension is, equivocally, planar geometry. These are ideal forms, impossible to express in our material reality, and exist as realms of pure equation. Without them, however, we could understand nothing of our own condition, and would possess no mathematics by which to quantify nature. In fact, without them, nature itself could not have assumed the forms and functions which we now know. However, even the simplest understanding we possess cannot belong to one of these dimensions alone. Consider the point, for example. Its properties are compression and scale correspondence, where the former applies to a singularity and the latter to planar geometry. Neither has any meaning except in relationship with the other, and what meaning we do comprehend of either is therefore a creation of both. Without the point, a Cartesian coordinate system could not exist, but without a singularity, there would be no point. Thus, natural progression continues upward through the dimensions even up to light and beyond, which I have here classified as the fifth dimension. This is due to the unique properties of light, which seem to imply a domain unto itself, particularly as it relates to time, the primary example of this being the seeming transtemporal nature of tachyons. The fourth dimension should be set aside for special consideration as well, as doing so now will relieve the pressures of later describing the particles it helps to form. The fourth dimension is simultaneously spatial and temporal, meaning that it generates highly complicated structures over fixed intervals. The complexity of its spatial component is due to its having as its foundation an open geometry, in progression from the flat second and closed third dimensional geometries. Its temporal component, however, is semi-second dimensional, as it is traditionally observed to unfold into a binary axis between past and future. I have demonstrated elsewhere that this relationship is indeed far more complex than this, but in the context of this exposition we need only remember these two defining traits for this dimension. Now we may consider the dimensional molecular cases of fermions and bosons. Fermions possess fractional spin as they occur between the third and the fourth dimensions. They arise as the result of the interaction of matter and energy between the pure formal geometry of the third dimension and the pure formal time of the fourth dimension. They begin as ultimate, unformed material chaos. As time passes, the mass becomes motivated, and an exchange of matter and energy begins to take place, constructing a framework of pre-existent geometric relationship to govern the materialization of real particles. Fermion symmetry is quarterly in three-dimensional coordinate space, meaning in any direction it is rotated, a fermion will look the same after less than one complete turn. In other words, its matter-energy structure is determined by geometric symmetry and temporal spin interaction. These may be measured as either particle or wave. Bosons arise similarly, but possess integer spin potential variability. The fourth dimension exists in field form, and the fifth dimension in no solid form at all, and therefore there are no geometric restrictions placed on symmetry. Bosons, thus existing between pure time and pure light, can only be measured as waves, and as such obey spin in accordance with oscillation interval, or frequency constant wavelength. The nature of further dimensions, and therefore implications for the particles they may generate through interaction, is discussed elsewhere.